Hi guys, tonight we explore a land that does not begin with an empire, but with silence. A vast plateau stretching beneath a pale sky where wind moves slowly across dry earth and distant mountains rise like quiet guardians. You find yourself standing here long before the name Persia exists, long before kings and armies and grand cities. The air feels cool in the early morning, and there is a stillness that suggests something ancient is waiting to be understood. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe let me know where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you're listening from. There is something strangely comforting about knowing that people across the globe are sharing this quiet moment together. Now dim the lights, and you begin to move slowly through this early world. You walk across uneven ground where small groups of humans have begun to settle. These are not yet cities, not even villages in the way you might imagine them. They are clusters of simple shelters made from medresdes and stone positioned carefully near water sources. Streams and seasonal rivers define everything. Without them, nothing survives. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that the Iranian plateau became home to some of the earliest agricultural communities thousands of years ago. People here learned to grow barley and wheat to domesticate animals and to adapt to a land that was both generous and unforgiving. This is one of the quiet foundations of what will one day become Persia. But what makes this place different is not just the presence of early farming. It is the environment itself. You feel it as you walk. The land is not easy. There are wide deserts where the heat presses down during the day and cold winds that move through the mountains at night. Survival here demands patience, demands planning, and slowly over generations it shapes the people who live here. Some researchers suggest that this harsh environment played a deeper role than we often realize. It did not just challenge early communities, it trained them. It encouraged mobility, adaptability, and a certain quiet resilience that would later define Persian civilization. The people who remained here learned not to depend on abundance, but to work with scarcity. You pass by a small settlement where smoke rises gently into the air. A woman grinds grain with a stone, her movements steady and practiced. Nearby, a group of children gathers around a shallow pit where water is collected. Their laughter is soft, carried briefly by the wind before fading into the open space. Life here is simple, but it is not easy. Archaeologists continue discussing whether these early communities were isolated groups or part of wider networks that stretched across regions. Some evidence suggests that even at this early stage, people were exchanging goods such as obsidian shells and early crafted tools across surprisingly long distances. If this is true, then connection, not isolation, may have been one of the earliest traits of this land. You notice something else as you move through the settlement. There is no central authority, no visible ruler, no grand structure that dominates the space. Leadership, if it exists, is quiet and local. Decisions are likely made within families or small groups. Power is not yet concentrated, and yet something is forming. You can sense it in the way people organize their lives, in the way resources are shared, in the way the settlement is positioned to maximize protection from wind and access to water. These are small decisions, almost invisible, but together they create stability. As the sun rises higher, the temperature begins to shift. The ground warms beneath your feet. In the distance, you see herds of animals being guided carefully across the land. Early herding practices are beginning to take shape, allowing people to move when necessary to adapt when conditions change. This balance between staying and moving becomes important. Some historians have suggested that this dual lifestyle, part settled, part mobile, became one of the long-term strengths of Iranian societies. It allowed them to survive droughts, invasions, and shifting climates. They were never entirely fixed and never entirely nomadic. They existed somewhere in between. You continue walking, and the land stretches endlessly ahead. There is no sense yet of borders, no clear definition of territory. But over time, these small communities begin to recognize each other. Paths form between settlements, knowledge is shared, traditions begin to repeat, and slowly, almost without anyone noticing, an identity begins to emerge. Not a national identity, not yet, but a shared understanding of how to live in this land, a shared rhythm of life shaped by seasons, by water, by survival. Some scholars remain divided about when exactly this sense of shared identity begins to take hold. Was it gradual forming over thousands of years through simple interaction, or did it emerge more suddenly driven by pressures such as climate change or competition for resources? The answer is not entirely clear. But as you stand here watching the quiet movement of daily life, it feels less like a sudden event and more like a slow, steady process. Something that grows quietly beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. You kneel down and touch the soil. It is dry but not lifeless. Beneath its seeds wait. Just as beneath this early world, something larger is beginning to take root. The people here do not know what will come. They do not imagine empires or kings or vast networks of roads stretching across continents. They are focused on the present moment, on the next harvest, on the next season. And yet everything that will come later begins here, in the very careful way water is managed, in the patience required to survive, in the quiet cooperation between small groups of people. As the light softens toward evening, the settlement becomes calmer. Fires are lit, the temperature drops again, though the sky begins to fill with stars clear and sharp in the open air. You look up and for a moment everything feels still. This land, harsh and beautiful, has already begun shaping something that will last far longer than any single generation. Not through power, not through conquest, but through endurance. And as you remain there in the fading light, you begin to sense that the true story of Persia does not start with its rise. It starts with its ability to survive. You remain in the quiet darkness for a moment as the stars settle above you, like a distant memory of everything that has not yet happened. The air cools quickly and a soft wind moves across the plateau, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry grass. When morning returns, the land reveals itself more clearly, and you begin to understand just how much it controls the lives of those who live here. You walk toward the horizon and the terrain shifts beneath your feet. What seemed flat from a distance becomes uneven, broken by ridges, valleys, and stretches of land that feel almost impossible to cross. To your left, mountains rise sharply, their peaks catching the early light. To your right, the land opens into vast emptiness, where the desert seems to stretch without end. This is not just a place where people live. It is a place that shapes how they think, how they move, and how they survive. A commonly accepted historical understanding tells us that the Iranian plateau sits between several major regions connecting Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley. This position made it a natural crossroads, but not an easy one. Travel here is slow. Routes must be learned carefully. Water sources are rare and precious. You begin to follow one of these early paths barely visible in the earth. It winds between rocky outcrops, avoiding the most difficult terrain. You realize that even at this early stage, people are already mapping the land in their minds. They know where to go, where to stop, where danger might appear. And yet the land does something else that is less obvious. It protects. Some researchers suggest that the natural barriers of this region, its mountains, deserts, and difficult terrain created a kind of quiet defense long before organized armies existed. Invading forces, if they ever reached this far, would struggle to move quickly. Supply lines would stretch thin. Communication would break down. This does not mean the land is safe. It means that survival here requires understanding it deeply. You notice how settlements are rarely placed in open areas. Instead, they are tucked into valleys near water, often with natural barriers nearby. It is not just about convenience. It is about protection from both the environment and potential threats. A small group moves past you, guiding animals carefully along a narrow path. Their pace is steady, unhurried. They know that rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes in this land can be costly. You sense a quiet awareness in their movements, a kind of patience that feels different from what you might expect. Life here teaches caution, but it also teaches connection. Archaeologists have found evidence that even in these early periods, communities on the plateau were not isolated. Tools, pottery styles, and materials suggest that people were exchanging goods across long distances. Obsidian from one region appears in another. Decorative items travel far beyond where they were made. You imagine these exchanges happening slowly over weeks or months. Small groups meeting at certain points, sharing good stories and knowledge. These are not large markets of delays. They are quiet interactions repeated over time, building trust. Some historians question whether these early networks were consistent or only occasional. It is possible that connections formed and disappeared depending on climate conflict or simple chance. But even if they were irregular, they left a lasting impact, because they introduced an idea that survival does not depend only on what you have, but also on who you know. You continue walking and the sun climbs higher. The heat begins to press down, especially as you move closer to the desert edge. The ground becomes harder, more cracked. Vegetation thins. The air feels heavier, almost still. And then unexpectedly you find water. A small spring emerges from the ground, surrounded by a patch of green that feels almost out of place. A few people gather here, filling simple containers, speaking quietly. This is not just a resource. It is a lifeline. Water determines everything. It decides where people live, where they travel, and how long they can remain in one place. In some areas, early communities begin to experiment with simple irrigation guiding water towards small plots of land. These efforts are basic, but they represent something important: control. Not control over the land itself, but over how it is used. Some researchers suggest that these early water management practices laid the groundwork for later innovation, such as canals underground channels that would allow water to travel long distances beneath the surface. These systems would become one of the hidden strengths of Persian civilization, allowing settlements to thrive even in dry regions. You pause and listen. The sound of water is soft, almost calming. It stands in contrast to the silence of the surrounding land. You begin to understand why these places become centers of life, of gathering, of decision-making. But water also brings tension. Archaeologists continue discussing whether competition over water sources led to early conflicts between groups. There are hints of defensive structures of settlements positioned in ways that suggest awareness of potential threats. If resources become scarce, cooperation can shift into competition. And yet, despite these pressures, something continues to hold these communities together. You notice it in the way knowledge is passed down. Older members of the group show younger ones where to find water, how to read the land, how to move safely. These lessons are not written. They are lived, repeated, remembered. This creates continuity. Even as conditions change, even as groups move or adapt, the knowledge remains. As the day begins to fade, the landscape transforms again. The harsh light softens, shadows stretch across the ground. The mountains, once distant, now feel closer, their shapes more defined against the evening sky. You find a place to sit overlooking a wide valley. From here you can see how the land connects, paths winding between settlements. Small clusters of life surrounded by vast open space. It is not dense, not crowded, but it is not empty either. It is balanced. And this balance becomes one of the quiet reasons why this region endures. Not because it is easy, but because it teaches those who live here how to adapt, how to move, how to survive without depending too heavily on any single resource or location. Some scholars remain uncertain about how much of this resilience was intentional and how much was simply the result of necessity. Did people consciously develop strategies to survive this land, or did the land itself slowly shape their behavior over generations? As you sit there watching the last light fade, it feels like the answer is somewhere in between. The land does not give instructions. It gives conditions, and over time people learn to live within them. The stars begin to appear again just as they did before. The air cools, the quiet returns. And once more you sense that what is forming here is not just a collection of settlements. It is a way of life, one that will continue, adapt, and endure long after the names and boundaries of future empires begin to change. The morning returns slowly, and with it a subtle shift in the rhythm of life around you. What once felt like scattered settlements now begins to reveal something more organized, though still quiet and understated. You walk along a familiar path, but this time you notice how it connects not just places, but people. There is a pattern forming. Groups that once lived in isolation are beginning to recognize one another more clearly. You see it in the way travelers are greeted not with suspicion but with cautious familiarity. You hear it in the exchange of words and shared gestures that seem to carry meaning beyond simple survival. The land is still difficult, still demanding, but within that difficulty something new is taking shape. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that over time, the peoples of the Iranian plateau began organizing themselves into larger tribal groups. These were not nations not yet, but they were more than scattered families. They shared language, customs, and a sense of belonging that extended beyond a single settlement. You begin to sense this as you move through a gathering. Several groups have come together near a water source, their animals resting nearby their shelters temporarily expanded to accommodate more people. There is a quiet hum of activity, food is prepared, stories are exchanged. Decisions are being made, though no single voice dominates. Leadership here feels different. It is not imposed, it emerges. An older man speaks and others listen not because they are forced to, but because his experience carries weight. A younger voice responds, offering a different perspective. There is discussion, not command. Authority seems fluid, shaped by respect rather than strict hierarchy. Some researchers suggest that this kind of early leadership structure based on consensus and reputation allowed these groups to remain flexible. Instead of rigid systems that could break under pressure, they developed ways to adapt to shift to respond to changing conditions. But this flexibility comes with its own challenges. You notice small tensions beneath the surface. Disagreements about movement, about resources, about where to settle next. These are not dramatic conflicts, but they are present. And as groups grow larger, these tensions become more difficult to manage. This is where identity begins to deepen. Not just who you are as an individual, but who you are as part of a group. You hear names spoken that refer not to people but to tribes. These names carry meaning. They define relationships, alliances, and sometimes rivalries. They create a sense of belonging that extends across distance and time. Archaeological evidence suggests that by this stage, cultural practices such as burial rituals and shared symbols begin to appear more consistently within groups. Objects placed with the dead patterns in pottery and repeated designs hint at a growing sense of collective identity. You walk past a burial site marked by simple stones arranged carefully. There is no grandeur, but there is intention. The placement of objects, the position of the body all suggest that these people are thinking beyond the present moment. They are beginning to think about legacy. Some historians have questioned whether these early tribal identities were stable or constantly shifting. It is possible that alliances formed and dissolved, quickly influenced by environment, resources, and leadership. The idea of a fixed tribe may not have been as solid as it appears from a distance. And yet as you observe the interactions around you, it feels like something more enduring is forming. A shared memory, stories passed down, not written but spoken. Tales of ancestors, of journeys, of challenges overcome. These stories do more than entertain. They connect people across generations, creating continuity in a world that is otherwise uncertain. You sit near a small fire as evening approaches. The light flickers softly, illuminating faces that are both familiar and unknown. Someone begins to speak, their voice calm and steady. Others listen closely, drawn into the rhythm of the story. You realize that this is where identity truly begins. Not in borders or structures, but in shared experience. As the story unfolds, it speaks of movement, of crossing difficult lands, of finding new places to settle. It speaks of cooperation, of survival, of moments where the group faced challenges and endured. These are not just memories, they're lessons, and over time they shape how decisions are made. You begin to notice that certain groups seem to carry more influence than others, not through force but through reputation. Their success in navigating the land, in managing resources, in maintaining stability gives them a kind of quiet authority. This influence begins to extend beyond their immediate group. Other tribes seek alliances looking for security, for shared strength. These alliances are not permanent, but they are significant. They create networks that span larger areas, linking communities that might otherwise remain separate. Some researchers suggest that these early alliances were the first steps toward larger political structures. Not planned, not deliberate, but emerging naturally from the need to survive and cooperate. But cooperation is never perfect. You hear a disagreement nearby. Voices raised slightly, though still controlled. It is about territory, about access to a water source that has become more limited as the season changes. The tension is real, but it does not erupt into violence. Instead, there is negotiation compromise. For now, archaeologists continue discussing whether these early societies experienced more conflict than the evidence suggests. The lack of large defensive structures might indicate relative peace, or it might simply mean that conflicts were small, localized, and left little trace. The truth remains uncertain. As night falls, the gathering begins to quiet. People return to their shelters. The fire burns lower, its light fading into the darkness. The air cools once again and the vast sky stretches above you. You lie back and look up just as you did before. But something feels different now. This is no longer just a collection of individuals trying to survive. It is a network of relationships, of shared identities, of emerging structures that hint at something larger. Not yet an empire, not yet a kingdom, but the foundation is there. In the way people come together, in the way they remember, in the way they adapt. Some scholars remain divided about how quickly these tribal systems evolved into more formal political entities. Was it a gradual process that took centuries, or were there moments of rapid change driven by specific leaders or events? As you drift in the quiet of the night, it feels like both could be true. Change, like everything else here, does not follow a single path. It moves slowly, shaped by countless small decisions, until one day it becomes something entirely new. And somewhere within these early tribes, within their stories and alliances and quiet negotiations, the first outlines of Persia are beginning to appear. The morning feels different this time. There is a quiet sense that something is beginning to take shape beyond the scattered rhythms you have been observing. The land is still vast, still difficult, but the people moving across it no longer feel entirely separate. As you walk along a familiar route between settlements, you begin to notice a new layer of connection. Something more structured, more intentional. You pass groups who recognize each other, not just as neighbors, but as part of something larger. This is where the Medes begin to emerge. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that by the early first millennium BC, a group known as the Medes had formed one of the first recognizable kingdoms on the Iranian plateau. They were not the first people here, but they were among the first to unify multiple tribes under a broader identity. You move through a settlement that feels more permanent than those before it. The structures are stronger, built with thicker walls, arranged with a sense of planning. There are areas that seem designated for gathering, for storage, for rest. It is subtle, but the difference is clear. This is no longer just survival. It is organization. You notice individuals who seem to carry more authority. They are approached with respect, their words listened to carefully. Leadership is still not absolute, but it is becoming more defined. Decisions are no longer made only within small groups. They begin to extend across wider communities. Some researchers suggest that this shift towards centralized leadership may have been driven by increasing pressure from outside groups. As populations grew and resources became more contested, the need for coordination and defense became more urgent. You can feel this tension even if it's not openly visible. There are signs of awareness now, of watchfulness. Settlements are positioned more carefully. Paths are monitored. Communication between groups feels more deliberate. The land that once isolated is now being navigated with purpose. You walk toward a gathering where several leaders have come together. Their clothing is slightly more elaborate, their presence more commanding, though still grounded in the same practical world. They speak in low voices, discussing matters that extend beyond a single settlement. Territory, security, alliance. These are new ideas, or at least newly important ones. Historians often point to a figure named Deiosis as one of the early leaders who helped unify the Medes. According to later accounts, he was chosen for his sense of justice, becoming a central authority that others turned to for resolving disputes. This marks one of the earliest known attempts at structured governance in the region, but the details are not entirely certain. Some historians question whether Deiosis was a real historical figure or a symbolic representation of a broader process. It is possible that the story reflects a gradual consolidation of power rather than the actions of a single individual. As you listen to the discussions around you, it feels less like the rise of one person and more like the slow acceptance of a new idea. That stability requires coordination. That coordination requires leadership, and that leadership must be recognized by many, not just a few. You begin to notice changes in how disputes are handled. Instead of being resolved within small groups, conflicts are brought before individuals who act as mediators. Their decisions carry weight beyond personal relationships. They are seen as representing something larger. This creates a new kind of trust, not just in people, but in system. You walk through an area where goods are being stored organized in a way that suggests planning for the future. Grain is kept in larger quantities, protected carefully. Tools are maintained and shared. There is a sense that these communities are thinking beyond the immediate moment. They are preparing. Some researchers suggest that this ability to plan collectively was one of the key factors that allowed the Medes to expand their influence. By coordinating resources and decisions across multiple groups, they created a level of stability that smaller isolated communities could not achieve. But with stability comes complexity. You notice that not everyone seems equally comfortable with these changes. Some individuals remain on the edges of the gathering quieter, more reserved. They observe but do not fully engage. The shift towards centralized authority is not universally accepted. This creates a subtle tension, a balance between tradition and change. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the Medes fully unified their territory, or if their control remained loose, more of a coalition than a tightly controlled state. The evidence suggests that while they achieved a level of unity, it may not have been as rigid as later empires, and perhaps that is part of their strength. You move beyond the settlement and look out across the land. Paths that once connected small groups now link larger regions. Movement feels more purposeful, communication is more frequent. The plateau is beginning to feel smaller, not physically, but socially. People are no longer isolated points on a map. They are part of a growing network, one that can respond to challenges more effectively, one that can coordinate on a larger scale. As the day fades, you return to the center of the settlement. A fire is lit larger than those you have seen before. More people gather around it, their voices blending into a steady hum. There is a sense of shared presence, shared identity, but also shared responsibility. You realize that this is a turning point. The Medes do not yet rule a vast empire. They do not yet possess the power that later Persian kings will hold. But they have done something important. They have shown that unity is possible, not through force alone, but through agreement, through shared purpose, through the recognition that survival can be strengthened when people act together. Some scholars remain divided about how influential the Medes truly were in shaping what came next. Were they the direct foundation of the Persian Empire, or simply one of many steps along the way? As you sit near the fire, watching the faces illuminated by its light, it feels like their importance lies not just in what they built, but in what they proved. That scattered tribes could become something more. That leadership could extend beyond a single group. That the land once a barrier could become a bridge. The stars begin to appear again, steady and distant. And beneath them, the first true kingdom of this land has quietly taken form. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in the same way everything here seems to happen. Slowly, carefully, enduring. The air feels heavier now, not with heat, but with expectation. You sense it as you move through the growing settlements where the quiet coordination you once observed has begun to concentrate into something more focused. The gatherings are no longer only about shared survival. They are about direction, about who decides where to move next, how to respond to threats, how to shape the future of this land. And within this shift, a figure begins to stand out. You do not notice him immediately. At first, he appears like any other leader, speaking calmly, listening carefully. But over time, you begin to see how others respond to him. There is a subtle change in posture and attention. People lean closer when he speaks. Decisions seem to settle more firmly after his words. This is the world into which Cyrus will rise. Long before his name carries weight across continents, he exists within this landscape of competing tribes, shifting alliances and emerging structures of power. He is not born into a simple world. He is born into one that is already changing, already searching for something more stable. You walk through a gathering where his presence is felt even if not always visible. Messages arrive from different groups carried by individuals who have travelled across difficult terrain. They bring news requests, concerns, and increasingly those messages are directed toward one centre. A commonly accepted understanding tells us that Cyrus, the great founder of the Achaemenid Empire, began his rise in the 6th century BCE by uniting the Persian tribes and eventually overthrowing the Median ruler Astyages. This moment marks a turning point where Persian leadership moves from regional influence to something far more expansive. But standing here in the quiet before that transformation, it does not feel like a sudden shift. It feels like a continuation. Cyrus does not create unity from nothing. He builds on what already exists. The networks formed by the Medes, the habits of cooperation, the understanding of the land, all of it becomes part of his foundation. You begin to notice how he moves differently from others. There is a patience in his approach. He does not rush decisions. He listens, gathers information, weighs possibilities. When he speaks, it is not with force but with clarity. This creates a kind of confidence among those who follow him. Some researchers suggest that one of Cyrus's greatest strengths was his ability to understand people as much as territory. He recognized that control was not only about land, but about loyalty. And loyalty could not always be demanded. Sometimes it had to be earned. You see this in the way alliances are formed. Groups that might once have resisted now choose to align themselves with him. Not because they are defeated, but because they see advantage in cooperation. They retain aspects of their identity, their leadership, their customs. In return, they become part of something larger. This approach feels different from the patterns you might expect. Power is expanding, but it does not crush everything beneath it. It absorbs. There is a story passed down through later sources that Cyrus was raised among humble people unaware of his royal origins for part of his early life. Some accounts describe a prophecy that threatened his rule before it even began, leading to attempts to prevent his rise. Whether this story reflects reality or later storytelling is uncertain. Some historians believe it was shaped to give his life a sense of destiny, a narrative that explains his later success. Others consider that fragments of truth may lie within it, altered over time through retelling. As you listen to these stories around the fire, you realize that they serve a purpose beyond accuracy. They create meaning. They frame leadership as something inevitable, something guided by forces beyond ordinary control. This strengthens belief not just in the leader, but in the system forming around him. You walk along a path that leads to a larger settlement, one that feels more organized than any you have seen before. Structures are arranged with intention. There are areas dedicated to administration, to storage, to gathering. Movement within the space feels directed, almost coordinated. This is not yet an empire, but it is moving toward one. You notice how information flows more efficiently. Messengers arrive and depart regularly. Decisions made in one place begin to influence others far beyond it. The land that once felt fragmented now begins to respond as a connected whole. There is also a growing sense of confidence, not arrogance, but assurance. People speak of expansion not as a distant possibility, but as something already underway. Nearby territories are discussed not with fear, but with curiosity. What lies beyond the horizon is no longer unknown. It is a potential extension of what is already forming. Some historians continue to examine whether Cyrus's early successes were primarily the result of military strength or political strategy. Evidence suggests that while he did command capable forces, his ability to incorporate conquered peoples without destroying their systems played an equally important role. As you move through this evolving world, it becomes clear that what is happening here is not just conquest. It is integration. You pass a group of individuals who speak slightly different dialects, wear different styles of clothing, carry tools that are not common in this region, and yet they move within this space as if they belong. Because now they do. This creates a different kind of power. One that grows not only by taking but by including. As evening approaches, you find yourself once again near a fire. The light flickers, casting soft shadows across faces that now represent a wider range of people than before. The conversations are richer, more varied. Stories from different regions begin to blend, creating a broader understanding of the world. You sit quietly listening, And you begin to understand that this moment is not defined by a single event. It is defined by a shift in how power works. Some scholars suggest that this shift from domination to incorporation may be one of the key reasons why Persian influence would last far longer than many other early empires. By allowing diversity within its structure, it created stability rather than constant resistance. The night deepens, the stars return, and as you look around you realize that the foundations of something vast are now firmly in place, not built through sudden force, but through careful expansion, through understanding, through the ability to turn difference into strength. And at the center of it, a leader who does not simply command, but connects. The world around you feels larger now, not because the land has changed, but because the connections between places have grown stronger, more deliberate. What once felt like distant regions are now linked by shared purpose. Movement is no longer random, it follows intention. You walk along a path that is wider than before its surface, worn smooth by repeated travel. Footsteps, animals, carts, all moving in a steady rhythm. This is no longer just a route between settlements, it is part of a system, and that system is expanding. By the time Cyrus fully establishes his rule, the territory under his control stretches far beyond what earlier leaders could have imagined. Lands that once stood apart are now part of a single political structure. From the Iranian plateau, outward regions of Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Beyond begin to fall within this growing sphere. This expansion is real, measurable and widely recognized as one of the earliest large-scale empires in human history. But what feels most unusual is not the soil, it is how that size is managed. You move through a newly incorporated region expecting to see signs of disruption. Instead, life continues in a way that feels almost familiar. Markets operate, local customs remain. People speak their own languages, wear their own clothing, follow their own traditions. There is change, but it is not overwhelming. It is layered. You notice officials present, but they are not imposing themselves on every detail of daily life. Their role seems focused, specific. They ensure or to collect resources, maintain communication. But they do not attempt to replace everything that already exists. This creates a kind of balance. Controlling. Without a forgotten. Some researchers suggest that this approach allowed the empire to expand more smoothly than systems built purely on force. Instead of constant resistance, there is a degree of acceptance. People are not asked to abandon who they are. They're asked to become part of something larger. You pass through a marketplace where goods from distant regions are displayed together. Textiles, metals, spices, crafted objects, items that once would have taken me. This is or years to encounter now appear side by side. This is not accidental. It is the result of growing networks that move through the empire, connecting places that were once separate. You hear different languages blending into a quiet background rhythm. Communication is not always perfect, but it is constant. Over time, understanding improves. Systems begin to form that allow these differences to coexist. There is an administrative logic developing beneath the surface. You notice records being kept not in a single language but in several. Clay tablets written carefully stored in organized spaces. These are not just lists of goods or names. They represent an effort to manage complexity, to make something vast feel structured. There is also a shift in how authority is expressed. Instead of being concentrated in one place, it is distributed. Regional leaders retain influence, but they operate within a larger framework. They answer to a central authority, but they are given room to manage local affairs. This creates a layered system, one that can adjust to different conditions. Some historians have explored whether this flexibility was a deliberate strategy or simply a practical necessity. Managing such a wide territory with limited communication would have made strict control difficult. Allowing local autonomy may have been the only realistic option, but whether intentional or not, it works. You walk through a settlement at the edge of the empire, far from the central regions, and yet you still see signs of connection. Similar systems of measurement, familiar patterns of administration, a shared understanding of authority. The distance does not break the system. It stretches it, and the system adapts. There is also a quiet confidence in how expansion continues. New territories are not always taken through prolonged conflict. In some cases, they are incorporated through negotiation, through alliances, through the recognition that joining this growing structure offers stability and access to wider networks. This is not always peaceful. There are moments of resistance, of conflict, of uncertainty. But the pattern that emerges is one of absorption rather than destruction. You notice how this affects daily life. People begin to think beyond their immediate surroundings. Opportunities exist in distant places. Travel becomes more purposeful. Knowledge spreads more quickly. The world feels more connected. At the same time, there is a deeper layer of complexity forming. With so many different cultures, languages, and traditions within one system, differences do not disappear. They remain sometimes quietly, sometimes more visibly. Managing these differences becomes an ongoing process. Some researchers continue to examine how stable this balance truly was. Did people fully accept this structure, or did tensions persist beneath the surface, waiting for moments of weakness? The answer is not entirely clear. As you move through the empire, you can sense both possibilities, a sense of unity, and a quiet awareness of difference. You arrive at a central administrative area where decisions are coordinated across regions. Messengers come and go, carrying information that links distant parts of the empire. The pace is steady, not rushed, but continuous. This flow of information becomes one of the key elements holding everything together. Without it, the system would fragment. With it, the empire functions. You pause and observe the movement around you. It is not chaotic. It is organized, though not rigid. There is space for variation, but also a framework that guides everything. This is something new, not just in size, but in structure. An empire that does not rely solely on force but on integration, on communication, on the ability to manage complexity without eliminating it. As the day begins to fade, you step back and look across the landscape. It stretches farther than you can see, connecting regions that once felt impossibly distant. And yet there is a sense that it all belongs to a single system, not perfectly unified, but connected. The sky darkens once again and the familiar quiet returns. But now that quiet carries a different meaning. It's not the silence of isolation. It is the calm of something vast functioning beneath the surface. And as you stand there, you begin to understand that this is one of the quiet reasons Persia endures. Not because it forces everything to be the same, but because it allows difference to exist within a larger whole. The rhythm of the empire settles into something almost steady. You move through its wide expanse, and what once felt like a fragile balance now feels more established, though never rigid. The land still stretches across mountains, deserts, and fertile valleys, but the system holding it together seems to move quietly beneath everything, like a current you can feel, but not always see. You begin to notice that power here does not always show itself directly. It exists in small details, in the way a local leader continues to govern his people without interruption, in the way a temple remains untouched, its rituals carried out as they always have been, in the way a language is spoken freely in markets, even far from its place of origin. This is not what you might expect from something so large. Instead of replacing what exists, the empire often leaves it in place. This approach becomes one of its defining features. Cyrus and those who follow him adopt a pattern that feels almost counterintuitive. When a new region becomes part of the empire, its traditions are not erased. Its leaders are often kept in position. Its beliefs are allowed to continue. You walk into a place of worship, its interior dim and cool compared to the outside heat. People move quietly, performing rituals that have been practiced for generations. There is no sign that this space has been altered or controlled by an outside authority, and yet it is part of the empire. This is not absence of power. It is a different expression of it. Some researchers suggest that this method created a sense of acceptance among diverse populations. By allowing people to maintain their identity, resistance was reduced. People did not feel entirely conquered. They felt included, even if that inclusion came with obligations. You step back into the sunlight and continue walking. The marketplace nearby is active, filled with voices, movement, and exchange. Goods from distant regions continue to flow through, but what stands out now is not just the variety, it is the familiarity. People have begun to expect this diversity. It no longer feels unusual. You overhear a conversation between traders from different regions. They speak in a shared language, though each carries a distinct accent. There is effort in their communication, but also patience. Over time, systems of understanding develop. This is how the empire breathes, through constant interaction, through quiet adaptation. You begin to understand that tolerance here is not simply an ideal. It is a practical solution to a complex problem. Managing such a wide and varied territory requires flexibility. It requires the ability to accept difference without losing structure. There's also something deeper at work. You notice that respect plays a role. Not just enforced obedience, but a recognition that local customs hold value. When leaders allow these customs to continue, they signal something important. That authority does not require complete control. Some historians have explored whether this approach was driven by philosophy or necessity. It remains unclear whether Cyrus and his successors believed deeply in tolerance as a principle, or whether they recognized it as the most effective way to maintain stability. Perhaps it was both. You walk along a road that connects several regions, and along the way you pass shrines, homes, and small communities that reflect different traditions. Each one feels distinct, yet none feel disconnected from the larger system. There is a quiet unity, not based on sameness, but on coexistence. You recall how earlier in the time of small tribes, identity began to form through shared stories and experiences. Now that identity expands further, it becomes layered. People belong to their local culture, and also to the empire. This dual identity creates strength, but it also requires balance. There are moments when differences create tension, disagreements over customs, over authority, over expectations. These do not disappear. They are managed, negotiated, sometimes resolved, sometimes simply tolerated. Archaeologists continue examining how deeply this sense of tolerance reached into everyday life. Was it consistent across all regions, or did it vary depending on local conditions and leadership? The evidence suggests variation. Some areas may have experienced greater freedom, while others felt more direct control. The system was not perfectly uniform. It adjusted context, and perhaps that adaptability is part of its success. You move toward an administrative center where representatives from different regions gather. Their clothing reflects their origins, their languages differ, but they sit together discussing matters that affect them all. This is not a meeting of identical people, it is a meeting of differences, and yet decisions are made. You sense that this requires a certain mindset, a willingness to accept complexity, a recognition that unity does not mean uniformity. As the day continues, you walk beyond the center and into a quieter part of the settlement. Children play, their laughter echoing softly. An older figure teaches them something simple, perhaps a task, perhaps a story. Life continues in small, familiar ways. The empire does not disrupt these moments. It exists around them, supporting, connecting, sometimes influencing, but rarely overwhelming. Some scholars suggest that this ability to integrate without erasing may be one of the key reasons why Persian influence lasted so long. By building a system that could include many different ways of life, it reduced the need for constant enforcement. You pause and look out across the land once more. It feels vast but no longer fragmented. It feels diverse but not divided. There is a quiet cohesion that holds everything together even when differences remain visible. As evening approaches, the light softens again. The same cycle repeats, but each time it reveals something new. You sit and watch as the sky changes colour, as voices fade, as the world settles into stillness. And you begin to understand that the strength of this empire is not always in what it changes, but in what it allows to remain. A system that grows not by forcing sameness, but by holding difference within a shared structure. A quiet form of power, one that does not need to announce itself loudly, because it is already everywhere. You begin to notice something else now. The empire is not only held together by ideas or leadership, it is held together by movement. a constant, steady flow of people, goods and messages that travel across the land in ways that feel almost invisible at first but soon become impossible to ignore. You step onto a road that feels different from the paths you have walked before. It is wider, more defined. The ground beneath your feet is packed, firmly shaped by a repeated use. Along its edges, markers appear at intervals, simple but purposeful. You realize this is not just a route created over time. It is a road that has been designed. This is part of what will later be known as the Royal Road, a network that stretches across the empire, connecting distant regions in a way that had rarely been achieved before. It allows messages to travel with remarkable speed, carried by riders who move from one station to the next without stopping for long. The distance between places begins to shrink, not physically but in experience. You walk for a while and soon you encounter one of these stations. It is modest but organized. Fresh horses are kept ready. Supplies are stored carefully. A rider arrives tired but focused, delivering a message before quickly preparing to continue. There is no delay. The system depends on continuity. Some researchers suggest that messages could travel across the empire in a matter of days rather than weeks or months. This level of communication changes everything. Decisions made in one region can influence another far away. Problems can be addressed before they grow too large. You watch as another rider prepares to leave. There is a sense of urgency but not chaos. Everything moves with quiet efficiency. This is not just infrastructure. It is connection made visible. You continue along the road and begin to notice how it affects everything around it. Settlements grow near its path. Trade becomes more active. Travelers from different regions pass one another regularly, exchanging brief greetings or quiet observations. The road creates opportunity. You pass a group of merchants transporting goods that have clearly come from far away. Their clothing, their tools, even the animals they guide feel slightly different from what you've seen before. And yet they move confidently as if this journey is expected. Because it is. Trade networks expand along these roads, linking regions in ways that allow resources to flow more freely. Materials that are rare in one area become accessible through exchange. This creates a kind of balance where scarcity in one place can be offset by abundance in another. You pause near a small gathering of traders who have stopped to rest. They speak in a mix of languages, using gestures and shared terms to bridge gaps in understanding. Over time, these interactions create patterns. Certain words become common, certain practices are repeated. Communication evolves, not perfectly, but effectively. There is also something else happening. Information moves with the same paths as goods. Stories, ideas, and knowledge travel from one region to another. Techniques for farming, methods of construction, ways of organizing life. These are not imposed. They are shared, adopted, adapted. The empire becomes not just a political structure, but a space of exchange. Some historians have examined whether this flow of information played a role in strengthening the empire beyond its physical reach. It is possible that the spread of ideas created a sense of familiarity across distant regions, making the system feel more unified. You walk further and notice how the road itself is maintained. It is not left to chance. Workers repair sections that have worn down. Obstacles are cleared. The path is kept usable even as conditions change. This requires coordination, planning, and a commitment to continuity. The road is cared for because it is essential. You begin to understand that this network is one of the hidden structures that supports everything else. Without it, the empire would struggle to function as a single system. Communication would slow, coordination would weaken, distance would become a barrier once again. But with it, the empire remains connected. You reach a point where the road splits, branching into different directions. Each path leads to another region, another set of communities, another part of the larger whole. It feels almost like a living system with lines extending outward, carrying movement in every direction. There is a quiet elegance to it, not overly complex, but deeply effective. Archaeologists continue to study how extensive this network truly was, and how consistently it was maintained across different regions. Some areas may have had stronger infrastructure than others, depending on resources and local conditions. But even with variation, the overall system holds. You sit beside the road as the day begins to fade. Travellers continue to pass through more slowly now. The light softens and the movement becomes quieter. You think back to the earlier days when paths were uncertain, when movement was slow and isolated. The difference is striking. Now distance feels manageable. Now connection feels constant. You realise that this is not just about efficiency. It is about cohesion. The road does not force people to be the same. It allows them to remain different while still being part of something shared. As the sky darkens, the last riders pass by, their silhouettes fading into the distance. The road remains stretching beyond what you can see, linking places you may never visit, but are still part of the same system. And in that quiet moment, you understand that one of the reasons Persia endures is not only in its leaders or its ideas. It is in the paths that connect everything together. Paths that carry not just goods and messages, but the very structure of the empire itself. The road fades behind you, but its presence lingers. Even as you move into quieter parts of the empire, far from the steady rhythm of riders and merchants, you can still feel its influence. The settlements you enter now are not isolated in the way they once were. They are connected even when the connection is not immediately visible. You walk into a village at the edge of a fertile valley. The air is warmer here, softer than the dry plateau you first crossed. Crops grow in neat patterns, guided by channels that carry water carefully across the land. The sound of flowing water mixes with the quiet activity of daily life. This is where the empire becomes something more personal. Not roads, not rulers, but ordinary people. You pass a group of farmers working slowly under the morning light. Their movements are practiced, almost rhythmic. They do not rush. They know the land, the seasons, the timing required for everything to grow. Their tools are simple but effective, shaped by generations of use. One of the quieter truths often overlooked is how much stability depends on routines like these. The empire may stretch across vast distances, but its endurance rests on small repeated actions. Planting, harvesting, storing, sharing. Without these, nothing lasts. You notice how water is managed with care. Channels are maintained, adjusted, cleared of debris. Each person seems to understand their role in keeping the system working. It is not enforced loudly. It is understood. This kind of cooperation creates a quiet strength. It is easy to focus on kings and armies, but here you see a different layer of power. One that does not announce itself, but sustains everything else. You move toward the center of the village where people gather near a shaded area. There is conversation, but it is soft, unhurried. Someone is repairing a tool. Another prepares food. Children move between them, learning simply by being present. Life continues in patterns, and those patterns create continuity. You begin to notice something subtle. Even though this village is far from the center of authority, there are small signs of the larger system. Measures used for grain feel consistent with those you have seen elsewhere. Certain administrative habits appear familiar. There is a shared understanding of how things are organized. It suggests that ideas travel even when people do not. You sit for a moment and watch as goods are exchanged. A trader arrives with items from another region. The interaction is calm, expected. There is no surprise in the presence of something distant. This is part of daily life now. Not unusual, not rare, just part of the rhythm. It becomes clear that the empire does not need to constantly remind people of its presence. It exists in the systems they use, the expectations they hold, the connections they rely on. And yet not everything is perfectly clear. It is difficult to say with certainty how much of this structure is actively guided and how much is simply developed over time. Some elements feel intentional, carefully organized. Others seem to emerge naturally shaped by repeated behavior rather than direct instruction. You notice a small detail that might easily be missed. Near the edge of the village, a storage area holds more grain than is immediately needed. It is protected, carefully monitored, quietly. This suggests preparation not just for the next season, but for uncertainty, for drought, for disruption, for anything that might come. This habit of storing, of planning beyond the present, becomes another quiet reason why the system endures. You continue walking and come across a craftsman working with metal. The sound of hammer against surface rings out softly, steady and controlled. He shapes tools that will be used across the region, perhaps even traded beyond it. Skills like this spread slowly, carried along the same paths as goods and stories. You realize that knowledge itself is part of the system, not centralized, not controlled in one place, but distributed, passed from person to person, from region to region. Over time, it creates a shared understanding that strengthens the whole. Some interpretations suggest that this spread of practical knowledge played a role in maintaining stability. When people across different regions develop similar techniques and expectations, cooperation becomes easier, but the picture remains incomplete. There are moments when differences create friction, variations in practice and belief in priority. These do not disappear, they are part of the system as well. You notice a quiet disagreement between two individuals over how water should be distributed. Their voices remain calm, but there is tension beneath them. Others listen, offering perspectives, guiding the conversation toward resolution. Conflict exists, but it is contained, managed within the rhythm of daily life. As the day moves forward, you begin to feel the pace of this place. It is slower than the roads, slower than the centers of power, but it is not stagnant. It is steady, reliable. This steadiness becomes one of the most important features of the empire. Not dramatic, not visible from a distance, but essential. You walk to the edge of the village and look out across the fields. The land stretches outward, shaped by human effort, but still guided by natural limits. The mountains in the distance remind you of where this journey began. The same land, the same challenges, but now a different level of organization exists within it. You think back to the early settlements where survival depended on small groups working together. That pattern has not disappeared. It has expanded, scaled outward, connected. The sun begins to lower and the light softens once again. The village quiets. The sounds of work fade into the background. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires, blending into the evening air. You sit and watch, feeling the calm settle in, and you begin to understand something important. Empires are not only built through expansion, they are maintained through repetition, through daily life continuing without interruption, through systems that become so familiar they no longer need to be explained. This is where endurance truly lives, not in moments of conquest, but in the quiet continuation of ordinary days. The quiet rhythm of the village lingers as you continue your journey. But as you move farther from the fields and into regions closer to the centers of authority, something begins to shift again. The calm stability you have just witnessed does not disappear, but it exists alongside another layer of life that feels more deliberate, more controlled. You arrive at a fortified settlement, its walls rising from the earth with a sense of quiet strength. They are not towering or excessive, but they are clearly designed with purpose. Entrances are narrow, movement is observed. There is an awareness here that was less visible in the open countryside, and yet there is no sense of constant conflict. You might expect that an empire of this size would rely heavily on force to maintain control, that it would be defined by armies moving endlessly across its land, suppressing resistance, enforcing obedience. But what you find instead is something more restrained. The presence of military power is real, but it's not always active. You watch a group of soldiers training in an open space to move. Their movements are coordinated, practiced, but not aggressive. They are preparing, not engaging. Their equipment is maintained carefully, their discipline evident, but they are not deployed constantly. This suggests something important. Control here does not depend on continuous war. It depends on readiness. There is a difference. One approach exhausts resources, demands constant attention, creates instability. The other allows life to continue while still maintaining the ability to respond when necessary. You walk along the inner part of the settlement where administrative buildings stand close to one another. People move in and out carrying messages, recording information, managing resources. The system you have been observing continues here, but with greater intensity. Decisions made in places like this ripple outward across the empire. And yet those decisions do not always involve conflict. Many are focused on coordination. on ensuring that regions remain connected, that resources are distributed, that communication flows without interruption. It becomes clear that the empire's strength lies not only in what it can conquer, but in what it can maintain. You pause near a group discussing recent events along a distant border. There has been tension, perhaps a minor conflict, though details remain unclear. The response being considered is measured, careful. There is no rush toward escalation. It is as if the system prefers stability over constant expansion. Some historians have explored this pattern, noting that while the empire did expand significantly, it also demonstrated periods of consolidation where the focus shifted toward maintaining what had already been achieved. This balance between expansion and stability may have contributed to its longevity, but this balance is not always easy to maintain. You notice that even within this controlled environment there are signs of pressure. The larger the system becomes, the more complex it is to manage. Information must travel accurately. Decisions must be implemented consistently. Small errors can grow as they move outward. There is no perfect control. Only ongoing adjustment. You walk toward the outer wall and look beyond it. The land stretches outward, calm and quiet. It is easy to forget standing here that this entire region is part of something vast, that this peace is not accidental. It is maintained. You begin to understand that the absence of constant war is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of control. When force is not needed, it does not need to be used. This creates a different kind of atmosphere. People move with less fear, trade continues without interruption. Daily life remains steady. The presence of authority is felt but not overwhelming. It is there in the background. Reliable. You return to the center of the settlement as the day begins to shift toward evening. The soldiers you saw earlier have finished their training. They move calmly, speaking quietly among themselves. Their role is clear, but it does not dominate the space. They are part of the system, not the center of it. You notice something else. The people here do not appear constantly concerned with defense. They are aware, prepared, but not consumed by it. This allows other aspects of life to develop. Craft trade administration culture. A system focused only on war leaves little room for these things. This one allows them to... It's difficult to know exactly how consistent this approach is across all regions. Some areas, especially those near borders, may experience more frequent conflict. Others may remain stable for long periods. The evidence suggests variation, but the overall pattern remains. Control without constant aggression. You sit near a quiet space as the light fades. The walls around you cast long shadows. The sounds of the day soften. Conversations become quieter. The sense of watchfulness remains, but it is no longer active. It settles into the background. You think back to the earlier stages of this journey. The scattered settlements, the fragile cooperation, the slow formation of identity. Everything felt uncertain then, dependent on immediate conditions. Now the system feels more established. Not unbreakable, but resilient. It must absorb pressure. It can respond to challenges without collapsing into constant conflict. And this becomes another quiet reason why this empire lasts. Not because it avoids war entirely, but because it does not depend on it. As night falls, the settlement becomes still. The gates remain closed, the guards remain alert, but the rest of life continues undisturbed. You look up at the sky once more, the same stars, the same land, but now held together by something more structured. A system that understands when to act, and when not to. You move farther west now, following the same lines of connection that have quietly held everything together. The land begins to change again. The air carries a different scent. The terrain softens in places, opens in others, and the settlements you pass reflect a slightly different rhythm of life. But beneath these differences, something else becomes clear. You're approaching a boundary that is not just physical, but cultural. You begin to hear new languages more frequently. The styles of clothing shift. The architecture feels unfamiliar in subtle ways. And yet all of it still exists within the same larger system you have been moving through. This is where the Persian world meets the Greek one. At first, the interaction is distant. trade observation, cautious awareness. Two systems existing near one another, neither fully understanding the other. But over time, that distance begins to narrow. You walk into a settlement where travellers from both worlds gather. Their conversations are quieter, more careful. There is curiosity, but also tension. Each side studies the other, trying to make sense of unfamiliar customs and ways of thinking. The difference is not only in appearance, it is in perspective. The Persian system you have been observing values integration, continuity, and layered authority. The Greek world in many regions emphasizes independence, local decision-making, and a strong sense of individual identity within each city. These differences do not immediately lead to conflict, but they create friction. You listen to a discussion between two traders, one from each side. They speak through a shared language, though not perfectly. The exchange is polite, but beneath it there is a sense of distance. Each understands the other, but not completely. It becomes clear that connection does not always lead to unity. Sometimes it highlights difference. As you move deeper into the border region, you begin to hear more about rising tensions. Not constant conflict, not yet, but growing unease. There are disagreements over influence, over territory, over control of key routes, and slowly those tensions begin to take shape. A well-established account tells us that the Persian Empire and various Greek city-states would eventually come into direct conflict in what are now known as the Greco-Persian Wars. These encounters would shape not only the future of both regions, but also how they understood each other. But standing here before those events fully unfold, it does not feel inevitable. It feels uncertain. There are still moments of cooperation. Exchanges continue. Ideas move between worlds. It is not a simple division. You pass a small group of individuals studying something together, perhaps a map, perhaps a set of measurements. Their clothing suggests different origins, but they work side by side. Knowledge, at least in some spaces, moves more freely than power. You begin to notice that perception plays a role in what comes next. Each side begins to form an image of the other. For some in the Greek world, the Persian system appears vast, powerful, but distant and controlled. For some within the Persian sphere, the Greek regions appear fragmented, independent, but unpredictable. These impressions are not entirely accurate, but they influence behavior. It becomes difficult to know exactly when tension turns into conflict. There is no single moment where everything changes. Instead, small incidents accumulate. Misunderstandings grow. Decisions are made that narrow the space for cooperation. Some interpretations suggest that the conflicts that follow were not only about territory, but about differing ways of organizing power. The idea of a large integrated empire meeting a collection of independent city-states creates a natural point of friction. But even this is not entirely certain. The picture remains complex. You walk along a coastline now where the land meets the sea. The sound of waves replaces the dry wind of the plateau. Ships move slowly in the distance, carrying goods, people, and information across waters that connect regions just as roads do. Here the boundary feels even less defined. Trade continues. Movement continues, and yet the awareness of difference remains. You sit near the shore and watch as the sun begins to lower. The light reflects off the water, creating a calm surface that hides the movement beneath. It feels similar to what you have been observing, a surface of interaction, with deeper currents below. You think about how the empire has managed difference within its own structure, how it has allowed various cultures to exist side by side, and you begin to wonder whether that same approach can extend beyond its borders, whether integration can continue outward, or whether there are limits. Some historians continue to explore whether the conflict between Persia and Greece was avoidable, or whether it emerged from deeper structural differences that made tension almost certain over time. The answer is not clear. As you sit there listening to the quiet rhythm of the water, it feels like both outcomes were possible at different moments. Moments where cooperation might have continued, moments where conflict became more likely. The light fades further and the shoreline becomes quieter. The ships in the distance grow harder to see. The conversations around you soften. You begin to understand that this is another turning point, not because the empire weakens, but because it encounters something it cannot fully absorb. A system that resists integration, a different way of organizing the world. And in that encounter, the calm continuity you have been following begins to face a new kind of challenge, one that does not come from within, but from the edge. The sound of the shoreline fades behind you as you move back inland. What you carry with you is not just the memory of the sea, but a sense that something has shifted. The Empire still stands wide and connected, its roads active, its systems steady. But beneath that steadiness, there is a faint tension, almost like a quiet vibration you can feel if you pay close attention. You walk through a region that once felt entirely stable. At first, nothing seems different. Markets continue, messages arrive and depart, officials carry out their duties with the same measured pace. Life moves forward just as it always has. But then you begin to notice small changes. Conversations pause more often when certain topics arise. Messengers seem slightly more urgent. Decisions once made with calm confidence now carry a hint of caution. The system is still functioning, but it is under pressure. It's easy to imagine that empires weaken through dramatic events, sudden collapse, visible crisis. But what you're witnessing here is something quieter, a slow strain. You pass through an administrative center where discussions are taking place. The voices are controlled, but there is a difference in tone. There is less certainty, more consideration. Reports from distant regions bring mixed news. Some areas remain calm, others show signs of unrest, though not always clearly defined. The challenge is not immediate collapse, it is complexity. As the empire grows, managing it becomes more difficult. Distances that were once bridged easily now require more effort to maintain. Information takes longer to move, decisions take longer to implement. Small delays begin to matter. You walk past a storage area where supplies are being counted carefully. There is a greater focus on measurement, on tracking, on ensuring that nothing is lost or mismanaged. This attention suggests that resources are no longer taken for granted. They are monitored, guarded, used with a greater awareness. A detail that rarely draws attention is how systems of administration can become both a strength and a burden at the same time. The structures that allow an empire to function also require constant maintenance. When they grow too complex, they can begin to slow themselves down. You begin to see signs of this. Processes that take longer, communication that requires more steps, coordination that feels slightly less fluid. It is not failure, it is friction. You move toward a gathering where local leaders are discussing recent developments. Their expressions remain calm, but there is a shared understanding that conditions are changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to require attention. There is also a shift in trust. Earlier, the system relied on a sense of stability that allowed decisions to be accepted easily. Now questions arise more frequently, not openly, not in a way that disrupts order, but quietly beneath the surface. It becomes more important to ensure that decisions are understood, not just delivered. You notice how this changes interactions. Conversations become slightly longer. Explanation more detailed. Agreement less immediate. These are small changes, but they accumulate. Some interpretations suggest that as empires expand, the very mechanisms that support them begin to stretch. Local leaders may adapt differently, regional conditions may vary more widely, maintaining consistency becomes harder. But the full picture is difficult to define. Not all regions experience the same pressure. Some continue to function smoothly, others show more noticeable strain. The system does not weaken evenly. You walk through a settlement where daily life continues much as before. Farmers work their fields, craftsmen shape their tools, children move through familiar routines. At first glance, nothing appears different, but if you stay longer, you begin to notice subtle shifts, a slight delay in the arrival of goods, a conversation about uncertainty in distant areas, a decision to store more than usual just in case. These are not signs of collapse. They are signs of awareness. The people here sense that conditions are changing even if they cannot fully define how or why. You continue walking and reach a point where the land opens into a wide plain. The sky above feels vast, almost empty. The silence here is deeper, less interrupted by movement. You stop and listen. There is no immediate disturbance, and yet the sense of tension remains. pains. It becomes clear that the Empire is entering a phase where maintaining what exists requires more effort than before. Expansion once brought new energy, new resources, new momentum. Now the focus shifts toward preservation, holding everything together, ensuring that connections remain intact, preventing small issues from becoming larger ones. You think back to the early days when small groups learned to survive by adapting to their environment. That same principle still applies, but now on a much larger scale. Adaptation is no longer local, it is systemic. Some historians continue to examine whether this phase of strain was inevitable in large empires or whether different decisions could have extended stability even further. It is difficult to separate structural challenges from specific events. The evidence allows for multiple interpretations. As the day begins to fade, you find yourself once again near a quiet gathering. The conversations are softer now, more reflective. There is still confidence, but it is tempered by awareness. The system still holds, but it requires attention, care, adjustment. You sit and watch as the light shifts across the land, turning the plain into a soft gradient of colour. The vastness remains, but it no longer feels entirely effortless. It feels maintained. And in that realization, you begin to understand that endurance is not only about strength, it's about the ability to recognize strain and respond to it before it becomes something more. The tension you sense does not break all at once. It gathers quietly, almost unnoticed at first, then begins to concentrate into something sharper, more focused. You feel it as you move through regions that once felt entirely stable. The systems are still in place, the roads still active, the routine still familiar. But beneath it all, there is a sense that something is approaching. Not from within, from beyond. You begin to hear a name, spoken though more often carried, in conversations passed between messengers, repeated with a mixture of uncertainty and urgency. Alexander. At first it feels distant, almost abstract. A figure from far to the west leading forces that move quickly, unpredictably. But as you continue walking, the distance begins to shrink. Reports arrive more frequently. Settlements that once felt secure now speak of encounters of movements that do not follow the patterns you have grown used to. This is not the slow expansion or careful integration you have observed. It is something faster, more direct. You reach a gathering where leaders are listening closely to a messenger who has just arrived. His voice is steady, but there is weight in his words. The forces he describes do not move like those of the Empire. They do not pause to integrate. They advance, and the speed itself becomes part of their strength. This is something new. You begin to understand that the system you have been following with its layers of coordination and balance is now facing a different kind of challenge. One does not seek to be absorbed, one that moves through rather than into. It's known that Alexander of Macedon defeated the Persian forces in a series of battles during the 4th century BCE, eventually leading to the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. These events mark one of the most significant turning points in the history of this region, but standing here before the outcome is fully clear, it does not feel inevitable. It feels uncertain. You walk through a settlement preparing for what may come. There is no panic, but there is urgency. Supplies are gathered. Messages are sent more frequently. The pace of movement increases. The system responds. But you can sense that it is not fully prepared for this kind of momentum. You pass a group of soldiers. Their expressions focus their movement sharper than before. They are trained, disciplined, capable, but there is something different in the way they prepare now. They are reacting, not setting the pace. This shift is subtle but important. You continue onward and begin to see the effects of these encounters. Not widespread destruction, but disruption. Paths that once carried steady movement now feel uncertain. Some routes are avoided, others are used more heavily. The pattern of the Empire begins to change. If you look closely, you notice something that is easy to overlook. The system itself is still functioning, but it is being forced to adapt more quickly than before. Decisions that once had time to develop must now be made faster. Communication that once flowed steadily must now respond to rapid change. The balance between control and flexibility becomes harder to maintain. You arrive at a larger centre where discussions are more intense. Leaders gather not in calm coordination but in focused deliberation. The atmosphere is still controlled, but the weight of the situation is clear. Different accounts suggest that the Persian response to Alexander varied across regions, with some resisting strongly and others adapting more quickly to the changing situation. The empire does not react as a single unit. It responds through its many parts, and those parts do not always move in the same way. You begin to see how the very strength of the system is diversity. Its flexibility can also create challenges in moments like this. Coordination becomes more complex when speed is required. Some areas hold, others shift. You walk through a region where life continues almost unchanged. Fields are tended, markets operate. The larger events feel distant here, almost unreal. And yet the awareness is present like a quiet echo. People know something is happening, even if they cannot see it directly. You move farther and encounter a place where the change is more visible. Movement is heavier, conversations are shorter. The focus has narrowed, there is less space for the slower rhythms of daily life. The empire is still vast, but its edges are moving. You sit for a moment watching the sky as the day begins to fade. The same cycle continues, but now it carries a different feeling. The calm is still there, but it's layered with anticipation. What happens next is not entirely clear. The details remain partially obscured by time, shaped by accounts that were written long after the events themselves. Some portray the fall as swift and decisive. Others suggest a more complex process with moments of resistance, adaptation, and transformation. As you reflect, it becomes clear that this is not simply an ending. It is a transition. The structures you have observed do not disappear overnight. They shift, they adjust, they continue in different forms. The identity that has formed across this land does not vanish with political change. It remains. You stand and look out across the land once more. The roads are still there. The settlements still stand. The systems still function, though under strain. And somewhere within all of this, a new phase is beginning. Not because everything has ended, but because something new is moving through, faster than before. Changing the shape of what has taken so long to build. The movement does not stop when power changes hands. You continue walking, and at first it feels as though everything should be different. New leadership, new direction, a new force passing through what was once a carefully balanced system. And yet as you move deeper into the land, you begin to notice something unexpected. Much of what you saw before is still here. The roads remain, the settlements continue their routines. Markets open as they always have. People wake, work, speak, and rest in patterns that feel familiar. The change that has taken place is real, but it does not erase what came before. It settles over it. You enter a city that has recently shifted under new control. There are signs of change. New officials, new symbols, subtle differences in how authority is expressed. But the structure beneath remains recognizable. Administration continues. Trade continues. Daily life continues. It becomes clear that what has been built here is not easily removed. Even when leadership changes, the systems remain useful. You walk through a public space where people gather. The conversations are quieter than before, more observant. There is a sense of adjustment, of watching and learning how things now operate, but there is no complete break. The transition is layered. Something easy to miss is how new rulers often rely on existing structures rather than replacing them entirely. It allows them to maintain stability while establishing their presence. It also reflects a practical reality. Building something new from nothing takes time. Using what already works is faster. You notice how familiar administrative practices continue even under new authority. Records are still kept. Resources are still managed. Communication still moves along the same paths. The system adapts. It does not disappear. You move through a quieter part of the city where older buildings stand beside newer additions. The architecture reflects this blending. Styles overlap. Materials differ. The past and present exist together, not in conflict but in gradual transition. You begin to sense that identity here is not tied to a single moment. It is cumulative, built over time, shaped by many influences. You pass a small group of individuals discussing recent events. Their perspectives vary. Some speak of loss, of change, of uncertainty. Others speak of opportunity, of new connections, of possibilities that did not exist before. Both views exist at the same time, and neither fully defines the moment. The record is not entirely clear on how people across the empire experienced this transition. Some regions may have adapted quickly, seeing continuity in the structures that remained. Others may have felt a sharper disruption, especially where leadership changed more abruptly. What becomes apparent is that the experience is not uniform. It shifts from place to place. You continue walking and come across a center of learning where individuals gather to exchange ideas. Their discussions move between different traditions, different languages, different ways of understanding the world. This is where something new begins to form. Not a replacement for what came before, but an addition. A blending. Ideas from the Persian world meet those from the Greek world. Methods, philosophies, observations. They do not merge instantly, but over time they begin to influence one another. You listen as one person explains a concept using terms that feel familiar, while another responds with a different approach. The exchange is thoughtful, patient. It reflects a willingness to explore rather than to replace. This is a quieter transformation, one that happens beneath the surface of political change. Some interpretations suggest that this blending of cultures created new forms of knowledge and expression that would not have existed otherwise. Others point out that not all aspects of these cultures were equally preserved and that some elements faded as new influences grew stronger. The picture is complex. It depends on where you look. You move back into the streets where daily life continues with its steady rhythm. Children play, craftsmen work, traders move goods through the same routes that existed before. The continuity is striking. You begin to understand that the endurance of this land does not depend on who holds power at any given moment. It depends on what continues beneath that power. The system, the habits, the shared ways of living. These do not change quickly. They adapt. You walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to soften. The light fades gently, casting long shadows across the ground. The air cools, carrying with it the familiar sense of stillness. You pause and look back. The city stands as a reflection of what you've been witnessing. Change layered over continuity. New structures resting on older foundations. Different influences existing side by side. You think back to the early settlements where identity first began to form through shared experience. That process has not stopped. It has expanded, incorporating new elements, adjusting to new conditions. The details remain partially obscured by time, shaped by accounts that do not always agree, but the pattern is visible. This land does not reset. It absorbs. It carries forward. As the sky darkens, the city quiets. The sounds of the day fade into a soft background. The presence of change remains, but it no longer feels overwhelming. It feels integrated, and as you stand there, you begin to sense that this is another reason why Persia endures. Not because it resists change, but because it allows change to become part of itself. The passage of time begins to feel less like a straight path and more like a quiet layering of moments. You move forward, but nothing truly disappears behind you. Instead, each phase settles into the next, leaving traces that continue to shape what follows. The empire that once stood under Cyrus has shifted, absorbed new influences, and now exists in forms that are not immediately familiar, yet still deeply connected to what came before. You walk across open land once more, where movement feels slower again, more grounded. The speed that accompanied Alexander's arrival is softened, replaced by something more measured. And gradually a new presence begins to form. Not sudden, not dramatic, but persistent. This is where the Parthians begin to rise. At first they appear as one of many groups within the wider region. Their movements are subtle, their influence limited. But over time they expand, building strength not through rapid conquest, but through patience. You encounter travelers who speak of them quietly, describing a power that grows at the edges before becoming more visible. Their approach feels different from what you have seen before, less focused on central control, more adaptable. You walk into a settlement where their presence is now established. The structure feels familiar in some ways, yet different in others. Authority exists, but it is less centralized. Local leaders retain significant influence and the system feels more distributed. This creates a different kind of balance, one that does not rely on tight coordination across vast distances, but on flexibility within regions. A widely recognized understanding tells us that the Parthian Empire emerged in the 3rd century BCE and became a major power, especially in its long rivalry with Rome. It controlled large parts of the Iranian plateau and beyond, maintaining influence for centuries. But what stands out as you observe this world is not just its reach, it is its approach. You notice that the system does not attempt to recreate the structure of the earlier empire in full. Instead, it allows variation to exist more openly. Regions operate with a degree of independence connected loosely rather than tightly. This can appear less stable, but it can also be more resilient. If one part changes, the others do not necessarily collapse with it. You move through a marketplace where goods still flow from different regions. Trade continues, though the routes feel less uniform, more dependent on local conditions. The sense of a single, tightly managed system has softened. In its place, there is a network, less controlled, more fluid. There is a quieter layer to this that might not be immediately obvious. This kind of structure makes it harder for outside forces to disrupt everything at once. Without a single center to target influence becomes more difficult to break. The system does not depend entirely on one point of control. You begin to see how this might be useful, especially in a world where large powers continue to interact, compete, and shift. You hear stories of encounters with Rome, a growing force to the west. These interactions are not always direct conflict. There are periods of tension, of negotiation, of movement along shared borders. And then at times there are clashes. You watch a group of fighters demonstrate their skills moving quickly across open land. Their technique feels different from the organized formations you saw earlier. It is more dynamic, more responsive to the terrain. This reflects a different way of engaging with both land and conflict. Not fixed, but flexible. Some accounts describe how Parthian forces use mobility and timing to their advantage, avoiding prolonged direct confrontation when possible. Instead, they adapted to conditions, responding in ways that suited their strengths. Whether every encounter followed this pattern is not entirely certain. The details vary depending on the source, and the full picture remains complex. But the impression is clear. This is not a system built on rigid control. It is one that adjusts. You continue walking and notice how cultural elements from earlier periods remain present. Language traditions, practices. They have not disappeared. They exist alongside newer influences, creating a layered identity that continues to evolve. This continuity is quiet but powerful. It does not depend on a single empire. It persists through change. You pause near a group gathered around a fire as evening begins to settle. Their conversation moves between past and present, between what was and what is. The transitions between these moments feel natural, almost seamless. There is no clear boundary where one phase ends and another begins, only gradual change. Some interpretations suggest that this ability to carry forward cultural identity even as political systems shift plays a key role in long-term endurance. It allows a civilization to survive beyond any single structure. But the exact nature of this continuity is difficult to define fully. It exists in habits, in language, in memory. You look out across the land as the light fades once more. The same patterns repeat, but each time they carry new layers. The early settlements, the first unifications, the vast empire, the transformation, and now this quieter, more flexible system. Each phase leaves something behind, and those pieces continue to shape what comes next. As the sky darkens, you feel a sense of calm return, not the calm of stillness, but the calm of continuity, a reminder that even as power shifts, something deeper remains, something that does not rely on any single moment, something that endures. The land stretches wide again and you feel the quiet return of distance, not the distance of isolation you experienced at the beginning, but a different kind. One shaped by borders that are not fixed, by lines that shift depending on a movement, negotiation, and time. You are now moving through a space where two large worlds press against one another, not constantly colliding but never fully separate. To the west, Rome. To the east, the Parthian realm you have just come to understand. Between them a frontier that is still. You walk across open ground where the horizon feels vast, almost empty. But this emptiness is deceptive. Beneath it there is movement. Patrols pass quietly. Messengers travel with purpose. Small settlements exist in places chosen carefully for both access and protection. This is not a peaceful border, but it is not constant war either. It exists in a state between. You come across a group of traders who have stopped near a narrow river. Their goods are varied, drawn from both sides of the frontier. They speak in mixed languages, their conversations shifting between tones of familiarity and caution. Trade continues here, even where tension exists. This is one of the quieter realities of these regions. Economic exchange does not always stop when political rivalry grows. In some ways it becomes even more important, creating a thread of connection that runs beneath the surface of conflict. You notice how carefully these interactions are handled. Nothing is rushed, nothing is careless. Every movement, every word carries a sense of awareness. This is how life continues in a place where uncertainty is constant. You walk further and begin to see signs of military presence, though not overwhelming. Small groups of soldiers move through the landscape, observing, adjusting, maintaining a presence rather than launching continuous action. They are part of their environment, not dominating it. You recall how earlier systems avoided constant conflict, relying instead on readiness. That pattern continues here, though, shaped by the reality of an active frontier. Encounters happen, but they are often limited, short, controlled. Some accounts describe moments where larger battles occurred between these powers, particularly in regions where influence overlapped more directly. These events could shift the balance temporarily, but rarely resulted in complete dominance by either side. The outcome is not decisive. It is ongoing. You walk along a ridge where you can see far across the land. In one direction, settlements that follow patterns you recognize from the Parthian system. In the other, signs of Roman presence, more structured in certain ways with their own methods of organization. The contrast is subtle but visible, and yet neither side fully overtakes the other. This creates a kind of equilibrium, unstable but persistent. You begin to understand that this prolonged interaction shapes both worlds. Each adapts not entirely but enough to respond to the other. Tactics shift, strategies evolve, expectations change. The frontier becomes a place of learning as much as conflict. There is a sort of detail that does not always draw attention. In places like this, people often develop identities that are not fully tied to one side or the other. They live between systems influenced by both, adapting to whatever conditions arise. You meet a man who speaks multiple languages with ease, moving between groups as if the boundaries do not fully apply to him. His clothing reflects more than one tradition. His knowledge of the land allows him to navigate spaces others might find difficult. He belongs to the frontier, not entirely to either side. This kind of life requires stability, and over time it creates a unique perspective. You sit near a small fire as the evening approaches. The people around you speak of recent movements, of shifting conditions, of opportunities and risks. Their tone is calm, but always attentive. Nothing here is taken for granted. The record offers different impressions of how stable this balance truly was. Some descriptions emphasize periods of relative calm where borders remained steady and interaction continued without major disruption. Others highlight moments of tension that nearly broke the equilibrium. What actually happened likely moved between these extremes, a constant adjustment. You look out across the land again as the light begins to fade. The horizon remains open, but now you see it differently. Not as empty, but as active. Every part of it shaped by movement, by interaction, by the quiet push and pull between two powerful systems. And yet neither fully erases the other. This becomes another pattern, endurance through balance. Not by eliminating opposition, but by existing alongside it. You think back to earlier moments when small groups learned to survive by adapting to their surroundings. That same principle is still present here, though on a much larger scale. Adaptation remains central, even when power grows. As night settles, the sounds of the day fade into a soft background. The frontier becomes quieter but not still. Movement continues even in darkness, though less visible. You remain there for a moment, feeling the calm that exists within this tension. And you begin to understand that not all strength comes from control. Some of it comes from the ability to exist without complete resolution, to endure without final victory, to continue even when the balance is never fully settled. The land begins to gather itself again. After long periods of movement, of shifting balance and quiet tension along distant frontiers, you start to feel something familiar returning. Not the same as before, not a repetition, but a reassembling. Pieces that had spread outward now begin to draw inward, forming a shape that feels more defined. You walk into a region where the presence of authority feels stronger once more. The settlements are more structured. The spaces between them feel more connected, but also more directed. There is a renewed sense of center, as if the land is no longer only adapting to change, but beginning to shape it again. This is where the Sasanian world begins to take form. It does not arrive suddenly. It grows from what remains from what has endured through earlier transformations. The identity you have been following, carried through tribes, empires, and shifting systems, now gathers into something more concentrated. You pass through a city that feels more deliberate in its design. The buildings are arranged with intention. Open spaces lead towards central structures that carry both political and symbolic meaning. The layout itself reflects order. There is a stronger sense of direction. You notice how authority is expressed more clearly here. Officials move with purpose, messages are delivered with precision. Decisions seem to flow from identifiable centers rather than being distributed loosely across regions. This marks a change, a return in some ways to a more centralized structure. If you pause and look closer, you can see how earlier patterns have influenced this form. The experience of managing large territories, of balancing diversity, of adapting to external pressure, all of it has shaped how this system is built. It is not identical to what came before. It is informed by it. You walk through a gathering where representatives from different areas meet. Their discussions feel more focused, less open-ended than before. There is still variation in their perspectives, but the framework guiding them is stronger. The center holds more weight. This creates a different kind of stability. Not the fluid balance of the Parthian system, but a more defined structure that seeks to bring coherence across regions. You begin to notice how cultural identity is emphasized more clearly as well. Symbols, rituals, and traditions that reflect a shared heritage are more visible. They are not only practiced, but reinforced. There is an effort to define what this world is, to give it shape. You enter a place of worship where the atmosphere feels calm, but also structured. The rituals follow a clear pattern. The space is maintained with care, its purpose understood by those who enter. Here belief and authority begin to align more closely. It creates a sense of unity, but also a sense of expectation. You realize that this alignment strengthens the system, but it also introduces a new kind of pressure. When identity becomes more defined, there is less space for variation. Balance must be managed differently. You walk through the streets and notice how daily life continues much as it always has. People work, trade, speak, rest. The continuity remains, but the framework around it feels more intentional. There is a clearer sense of belonging to something larger, and a clearer understanding of what that larger structure expects. The accounts of this period seem to describe a renewed Persian Empire that sought to reassert its presence and influence, particularly in relation to its long-standing interactions with Rome. It was not only a continuation, but a redefinition. Yet what makes this moment difficult to interpret is how much of it reflects deliberate design, and how much emerges naturally from the conditions of the time. The boundaries between intention and adaptation are not always clear. You walk toward the edge of the city and look outward. The land stretches as it always has, but now it feels more contained within a system that understands its own structure more clearly. There is confidence here, not the quiet flexibility of earlier phases, but a more grounded sense of identity. You hear conversations that reflect this shift. People speak of who they are not only in local terms, but as part of a broader whole. This identity feels more defined, more consciously held. It strengthens connection, but it also requires maintenance. You begin to see how this phase represents another layer in the long story you've been following. The early settlements created survival. The first empires created connection. The later system introduced flexibility, and now this moment brings consolidation, a gathering of identity, structure, and purpose. As evening approaches, the light softens across the city. The same quiet returns, but it carries a different tone now. It feels more settled, more grounded. Grounded. You sit and watch as the world around you moves into stillness, and you begin to understand that endurance does not come from remaining the same. It comes from knowing when to change direction, when to gather what has been scattered, when to define what has been fluid. The sky darkens and the stars appear once more, and beneath them a new form of Persia stands, not entirely new, not entirely old, but shaped by everything that came before. The sense of structure deepens as you continue forward. What once felt like a quiet framework beneath daily life now becomes more visible, more present in the way people move, speak, and understand their place in the world. There is a stronger connection between belief and authority, between what people practice and how power is organized. You step into a space where fire burns steadily contained within a carefully maintained structure. The air is warm, carrying a faint scent of smoke and something older, something that feels rooted in long tradition. People move with intention, their actions measured, their expressions calm. This is not just ritual, it is continuity made visible. Zoroastrian belief, which has existed in earlier forms, now stands more clearly at the center of this world. It shapes not only how people understand the universe, but also how they understand order, responsibility, and balance. You watch as a figure tends to the fire, ensuring that it remains pure, uninterrupted. The act is simple, but it carries weight. It reflects an idea that the world itself must be maintained, that fact order does not exist on its own. It requires care. You begin to see how this belief connects to governance. Authority is no longer only about coordination or control, it is tied to a larger sense of purpose. Rulers are not just leaders. They are seen as part of a system that maintains balance between opposing forces, between what is right and what is harmful. This creates a powerful connection, but also a responsibility. If you pause and observe closely, you notice how this influence reaches into daily life. Decisions are framed not only in practical terms, but in moral ones. Actions are measured against a sense of order that extends beyond immediate outcomes. This shapes behavior. It guides choices. You walk through a gathering where discussions are taking place. The tone is thoughtful, deliberate. There is an awareness that decisions carry weight beyond the present moment. They affect not only people, but the balance of the world as it is understood. This creates a sense of unity. People share not only systems and structures, but a way of interpreting reality. At the same time, there is a quieter layer to this. Not everyone experiences this connection in the same way. In some areas, these beliefs are deeply integrated into everyday life. In others, older traditions remain strong, blending with newer influences rather than being replaced entirely. The accounts do not always align on how consistent this integration was across different regions. Some suggest a strong alignment between belief and authority. Others point to variation to places where local practices continued alongside the dominant system. The truth likely exists between these perspectives. You move through a part of the city where artisans work shaping objects that carry symbolic meaning. Patterns repeat designs, echo ideas that reflect order, symmetry, balance. Even in these smaller details, the influence of belief is present. It becomes part of the environment, something that surrounds people without always being consciously noticed. You begin to understand that this connection between belief and power strengthens the system in a unique way. It provides not only structure but meaning. It explains why things are organized as they are. It gives purpose to authority, but it also introduces a new kind of tension. When belief and power are closely linked, challenges to one can affect the other. Differences in interpretation, variations in practice, questions about authority. All of these can carry deep implications. You notice this in a quiet conversation between two individuals. They speak carefully, discussing a matter that touches both governance and belief. Their words are measured, aware of the significance behind them. This is not open conflict, but it is complexity. The picture becomes more layered. You walk toward the edge of the settlement as the day begins to soften. The light fades gently, casting a warm glow across the structures. The fire within the temple continues to burn steady and constant. It feels symbolic, a reflection of continuity. You think back to earlier moments when survival depended on adapting to the land, when identity formed through shared experience, when systems developed to connect distant regions. Now belief itself becomes part of that system, a way to hold everything together. You sit and watch as the sky darkens once more. The quiet returns, but it carries a deeper resonance now. It is not only the absence of noise, it is the presence of something steady, something maintained over time. You begin to see how this layer contributes to endurance, not through force, not through expansion, but through meaning, a shared understanding of how the world works and how people fit within it. The details may shift, interpretations may vary, but the underlying idea remains. And as the stars appear above you, you feel that continuity once again. A thread that runs through everything, connecting belief, power, and daily life into a single enduring pattern. The sense of order you have been following begins to carry a different weight. At first it still feels steady. The structures are clear, the beliefs are present, the system continues to function. But as you move through the cities and across the land, you begin to notice something that does not stand out immediately. The effort required to maintain all of this. You walk along a wide avenue leading toward a central complex where officials gather and decisions are made. The buildings are strong, the layout precise. Everything appears controlled as it should be. But if you look closely, you can see how much attention is required to keep it that way. Messages arrive constantly, each carrying information that must be processed, understood, and acted upon. Resources are tracked, carefully moved from one region to another, with increasing coordination. The system is active at all times. It does not rouse. You begin to understand that the larger the structure becomes, the more it depends on continuous input. Nothing can be left unattended for long. You pass a group of administrators reviewing records, their focus intense. They compare figures, check reports, discuss adjustments. The work is methodical, but there is a sense of urgency beneath it. Not panic, but pressure. This is not always visible from a distance. The empire still appears strong, still connected, still functioning. But beneath that surface there is a growing complexity that requires more effort to manage. You continue walking and notice how this complexity extends into daily life. Taxes are collected with greater precision. Supplies are measured more carefully. Expectations are clearer but also more demanding. People understand their roles, but those roles carry more responsibility than before. There is a subtle shift in tone. Less ease, more structure. What rarely gets mentioned is how systems that succeed can become heavy over time. The very mechanisms that allow them to function begin to require constant maintenance. Layers build upon layers, and each one must be supported. You begin to feel that weight, not in a single moment, but gradually. You move through a marketplace that still operates, still active, still full of movement, but the conversations are slightly different. There is more awareness of obligation, of what must be provided and of what is expected in return. Trade continues, but it is more regulated. You notice a merchant carefully accounting for his goods, his expression focused. He is not only thinking about exchange, but about compliance, about ensuring that everything aligns with the broader system. This reflects a deeper change. Freedom within the system becomes more structured. You walk toward a quieter area and see workers maintaining infrastructure. Roads are repaired, water systems are cleared and adjusted, buildings are reinforced. These tasks have always existed, but now they feel more constant, more necessary. The system depends on them more than ever. You begin to see how this creates a kind of strain, not visible as conflict, but present as effort. You pass a group of individuals discussing conditions in distant regions. Their conversation is calm but detailed. They speak of variations of areas where resources are tighter, where conditions require closer attention. The empire is not uniform. Some parts carry more weight than others. Some regions require more support. This unevenness adds another layer of complexity. The accounts from this period suggest a powerful and organized system, but they also hint at the challenges of maintaining such a structure over time. The scale itself becomes a factor that cannot be ignored. It shapes every decision. You sit near a shaded area as the day begins to soften. The activity around you continues, but you take a moment to observe the rhythm more closely. It is steady, but it is also demanding. Every part of the system relies on another. If one slows, others must adjust. If one weakens, others must compensate. The balance you have been observing becomes more difficult to sustain. You begin to understand that strength and strain can exist at the same time, that a system can appear stable while quietly working harder to maintain that stability. You think back to earlier phases when flexibility allowed adaptation, when decentralization created resilience. Now, with stronger central structure, there is greater control but also greater responsibility concentrated in fewer places. This changes the nature of endurance. It becomes more dependent on consistency, on precision, on the ability to manage complexity without interruption. You look out across the city as the light begins to fade. The buildings stand firm. The people continue their routines. The system remains intact. But you can feel the effort behind it, a quiet, constant effort. As evening settles, the sounds soften and the pace slows. For a moment, everything feels calm again. But now you understand that this calm is maintained, not effortless, not automatic. It requires attention, coordination, and continuous adjustment. And in that realization, you begin to see another layer of the story. That endurance is not only about building something strong, it is about sustaining it, even as the weight of that strength grows heavier over time. The weight you have been sensing does not disappear. It continues quietly, carried through the structures, the routines, the expectations that have grown over time. But now as you move forward, something begins to approach that does not come from within the system. It comes from beyond. You walk across a stretch of land where the air feels different, not in temperature but in atmosphere. There is a kind of anticipation, though not clearly defined. People continue their work, their routines, their conversations, yet beneath it there is a subtle awareness that something unfamiliar is moving closer. At first, it is not obvious. You hear fragments of information carried by travelers who have come from far regions. They speak of new forces of movements that do not follow the patterns you have seen before. The details are unclear, sometimes inconsistent, but they repeat often enough to draw attention. You continue walking and reach a settlement where these conversations are more focused. Groups gather, speaking quietly, exchanging what they know. The tone is not alarmed, but attentive. The pattern you have been following begins to shift again, this time more abruptly. You begin to hear of rapid expansion of territories changing hands more quickly than expected. The pace feels unfamiliar. It does not follow the slower rhythms of the earlier transformations. It moves with momentum. It is known that in the 7th century, Arab forces expanded rapidly across the region, leading to the decline of the Persian Empire. These events would reshape not only political structures, but also cultural and religious landscapes. But as you stand within this moment, the outcome is not yet fully formed. It feels uncertain. You walk through a place where preparations are being made, supplies are gathered, messages are sent more frequently. The system responds as it has before, but there is a difference. The speed of change is harder to match. You notice how communication, once steady and reliable, now feels pressured. Information arrives, but it changes quickly. Decisions must be made with less time for reflection. This creates tension within the structure. You pass a group of soldiers, their presence more active now. Their movements are sharper, their focus more immediate. They are no longer simply maintaining readiness. They are preparing for engagement. You continue onward and begin to see the effects of these encounters. Some areas remain calm, holding their structure. Others show signs of disruption where routines are interrupted and movement becomes less predictable. The change is not uniform. It spreads unevenly. If you look closely, you can see how different regions respond in different ways. Some attempt to hold their existing structure firmly. Others begin to adjust more quickly, adapting to the new conditions. There is no single response, only variation. The accounts from this period do not always align perfectly. Some describe swift changes that moved rapidly across the land. Others suggest moments of resistance, of slower transformation, where older systems continued for a time alongside new ones. The reality likely moved between these perspectives, a process that was both rapid and gradual depending on where you stand. You walk through a settlement where the change is more visible. New influences appear in small ways. Language shifts slightly in certain conversations. Practices begin to adjust, though not completely. The older patterns do not vanish. They coexist, at least for a while. You begin to understand that this is not simply a replacement. It is a transition, one that reshapes the structure but does not erase everything beneath it. You sit near a quiet space as the day begins to fade. The conversations around you reflect uncertainty but also resilience. People continue to adapt as they have done before, even as the conditions change more quickly than expected. You think back to earlier moments in this journey, the first settlements adapting to the land, the rise of coordinated systems, the balance between flexibility and control. Control. Each phase required adjustment, and now that pattern continues, but under greater pressure. You look out across the land as the light softens. The same terrain stretches outward, but the structures within it are shifting once more. The identity you have been following does not disappear. It transforms, it absorbs new elements, it adjusts to new conditions. As night settles, the quiet returns, though it carries a different tone now. It feels less certain, more open, as if the next phase has not yet fully defined itself. And perhaps it has not. You remain there for a moment, listening to the stillness, and you begin to see that endurance does not mean remaining unchanged. It means continuing even when everything around you begins to shift. The shift does not settle immediately. You continue walking and the land feels familiar, yet the patterns within it are adjusting in ways that take time to fully reveal themselves. The structures you have followed for so long are still present in fragments, in habits, in the way people move through their days. But alongside them, something new is taking shape. It does not replace everything at once. It grows within what already exists. You enter a town where the atmosphere feels layered. Conversations carry familiar tones, but new words appear within them. The cadence of speech changes slightly, almost imperceptibly at first. It is not a sudden transformation. It is a gradual blending. Language becomes one of the first places where this shift is visible. You hear phrases that combine older expressions with newer influences. Over time, these combinations settle into patterns. What begins as variation slowly becomes normal. This is how change embeds itself, quietly. You walk through a marketplace where goods continue to move as they always have. The items feel familiar, but the interactions around them carry subtle differences. Measures, agreements, expectations, all adjusting in small ways. Nothing stops. It evolves. If you pause and listen more closely, you notice how stories are told differently. Older narratives remain, but they are framed in new ways. Meanings shift slightly, reflecting a broader perspective that includes both past and present. This is not loss. It is transformation. You pass a group gathered around a figure reciting something from memory. The words are structured, rhythmic, carrying a sense of importance. The listeners respond with attention not because the form is entirely new, but because it resonates with what they are beginning to understand. There is a continuity here, but also a redefinition. The emergence of Persian language in a new script influenced by Arabic becomes one of the most significant developments of this period. It allows older cultural expressions to continue while adapting to a changing environment. But what makes this moment difficult to define is how seamlessly these elements combine. There is no clear boundary where one ends and the other begins. You walk toward a quieter part of the town and notice how education takes place. Knowledge is shared through conversation, through repetition, through observation. The methods are familiar, but the content expands. New ideas enter the swore. They do not erase what was there before. They sit alongside it. You begin to see how this creates a layered identity. People carry their past with them, but they also engage with new influences. Over time, these layers become integrated, forming something that feels both continuous and new. You encounter a scholar working with text, carefully copying words onto a surface, and the script is precise, the structure deliberate. He pauses occasionally, considering the meaning behind what he writes. This is not just preservation, it is interpretation. The knowledge being passed down is not static. It is shaped by those who engage with it, who understand it within the context of their own time. There are hints, but no complete picture of how widespread this transformation felt to those living through it. Some may have experienced it as a natural progression. Others may have felt the tension between maintaining tradition and adapting to change. The experience likely varied. You move through the streets as the day continues, noticing how daily life carries on without interruption. People work, trade, speak, rest. The rhythm remains steady. But beneath that rhythm, the meaning of things is shifting. You think back to earlier moments in your journey, when identity formed slowly through shared experience, when systems developed to connect distant regions, when belief became a central force. Now language and culture take on a new role. They become the medium through which continuity is preserved. Even as structures change, you walk toward the edge of the town and look out across the land. The same landscape stretches before you, unchanged in its physical form. But the way it is understood, the way it is described, the way it is remembered, all of this continues to evolve. This is a quieter form of endurance, not held in power or territory, but in expression, in the ability to carry forward ideas, stories, and identity through changing conditions. As evening approaches, the light softens once more. The town begins to quiet. Voices fade into the background. The movement of the day slows. You sit and listen, and you begin to understand that this phase of the journey is not about rebuilding what was lost. It is about redefining what remains, taking what has endured, and shaping it into something that can continue. The sky darkens and the stars return, and beneath them the story moves forward, not as a repetition, but as a continuation in a new form. The rhythm of change begins to settle into something quieter again. You move through cities that feel more alive than before, not in noise, but in thought. The streets carry movement as they always have, but there is a new layer beneath it, one that is less visible and more reflective. Conversations stretch longer. Questions seem to reach further. You step into a courtyard where people gather not to trade or organize, but to think. It is a different kind of activity. You see individuals sitting together discussing ideas that move beyond immediate concerns. They speak of numbers, of stars, of the nature of things that cannot be held in the hand. Their words are careful, deliberate, shaped by curiosity as much as by knowledge. This is where something begins to expand inward, a quiet turning toward understanding. You sit at the edge of the gathering and listen. One person traces patterns in the sand, explaining a concept that seems abstract at first, then slowly becomes clearer. Another responds, offering a different perspective, refining the idea rather than replacing it. The exchange is calm, focused. You begin to notice that this kind of interaction is not limited to one place. It appears in different forms across the land, spaces where learning is shared, where knowledge is explored, where ideas move between people with patience. What emerges here is often described as a period of intellectual growth where Persian scholars and thinkers contributed to developments in science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy within a broader cultural world. But what stands out as you observe it is not only the knowledge itself, it is the environment that allows it to grow. You walk through a building where texts are stored, arranged with care. Shelves hold works that have been copied and recopied, preserved through effort and attention. The space is quiet, almost still, but filled with meaning. This is where memory is kept, not just of events, but of ideas. You notice how individuals approach these texts. They do not simply read, they engage. They question, interpret, expand. The knowledge here is not fixed. It is There is a sense that understanding is something that evolves. You pass a group working with instruments, observing the sky as evening begins to approach. They measure, record, compare. Their focus is steady, their attention precise. The world is being studied, not only experienced. You begin to see how this reflects a broader shift. Earlier survival shaped life, then structure shaped it. Now understanding becomes part of that structure. A way to navigate not just the physical world, but the conceptual one. If you listen closely, you can hear how ideas from different traditions blend within these discussions. Concepts that originated in one place are examined alongside those from another. There is no clear boundary between sources. They are combined, adapted, refined. The story becomes harder to pin down here. There is no single origin for what you're witnessing. It is the result of many influences, many contributions, many moments of exchange that have layered over time. You walk into another part of the city where education takes place more formally. A teacher speaks and others listen, their attention focused. The structure is clear, but the tone remains calm, open to exploration. Learning is guided, but not restricted. You notice a small detail that feels important. Questions are encouraged. Notice me. This creates a different kind of environment, one where knowledge can grow beyond what is already known. You think back to earlier phases of your journey, when identity formed through shared experience, when systems connected distant regions, when belief shaped understanding. Now knowledge itself becomes a connecting force, linking people across distances, across time. You walk through the streets as the light begins to fade. The activity continues, but it carries a quieter energy. Conversations remain thoughtful, measured, reflective. There is a sense that something deeper is taking place beneath the surface of daily life, not visible in structures or border, but present in thought. You move toward a quiet space and sit watching as the sky darkens. The stars appear once more the same as they have been throughout your journey, but now they are observed differently, measured, considered, understood in ways that go beyond simple wonder, and yet the sense of wonder remains. It is not replaced, it is deepened. You begin to understand that this phase of the story is not about expansion in the traditional sense. It is about depth, about exploring what lies within the systems that have been built, about understanding the world more fully. As the night settles, the city quiets, but the thinking does not stop. It continues in quiet spaces, in conversations, in the careful work of those who seek to understand. And in that quiet you see another form of endurance, not through power, not through structure, but through knowledge, something that can move across time, adapting, growing, continuing long after the moment that created it has passed. The quiet pursuit of knowledge does not remain still. It begins to move outward, carried by people shaped by changing conditions, influenced by forces that are both internal and external. You continue walking, and the cities you enter now feel more complex, not only in structure but in how power operates within them. There is no single center, no single voice. Instead, authority shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes more suddenly, depending on the moment and the place. You walk through a region where a new ruling presence has established itself. The transition is visible in symbols, in the way officials present themselves, in the language of administration. But beneath that much remains familiar. The systems you have been following continue to function, adapted, adjusted, carried forward. You begin to notice how this pattern repeats across different areas. Dynasties rise, bringing new emphasis, new direction. But they do not begin from nothing. They build on what already exists, shaping it to fit their needs. This creates continuity through change, a rhythm that repeats without fully repeating itself. You pass through a marketplace where goods from distant regions continue to arrive. The routes remain active, though sometimes altered. The connections between places endure even as the structures that manage them shift. Trade does not stop. It adapts. You notice how people speak of leadership with a mixture of familiarity and distance. Rulers are known, but they are not always constant. Their presence is felt through systems rather than direct interaction. This creates a different relationship with power, one that is both present and distant at the same time. If you pause and observe more closely, you can see how local life continues with its own rhythm, largely unaffected by changes at higher levels. Families maintain their routines, communities organize themselves, traditions are practiced. The larger shifts occur above this layer, but they do not fully disrupt it. You walk into a courtyard where individuals discuss recent changes in leadership. Their conversation is calm, reflective. They consider how new policies might affect trade, taxation, daily life. There is awareness, but not instability. This suggests something important, that the underlying system has become strong enough to absorb change without collapsing. You begin to see how this is possible. The layers of identity, culture, and practice that have developed over time provide a kind of foundation. Political structures may shift, but these deeper layers remain. They support continuity. You pass a group of travelers who speak of distant regions where conditions differ. Some areas experience more disruption, more noticeable shifts. Others remain relatively stable, continuing much as before. The experience is not uniform. It depends on who you stand. The fragments that reach you from this period do not always align perfectly. Some describe times of fragmentation where authority is divided and contested. Others highlight moments of stability where systems continue to function effectively despite changes above them. Both impressions seem to exist, side by side. You walk along a narrow street where artisans continue their work. The sound of tools against material creates a steady rhythm. Their focus is on the task at hand, not on distant changes. This reflects a deeper truth. Daily life provides continuity even when larger structures shift. You notice how knowledge continues to move as well. Ideas travel along the same paths as goods carried by individuals who move between regions. The intellectual life you observed earlier does not disappear. It evolves, adapting to new conditions. You come across a small group engaged in discussion, their words thoughtful, their tone measured. They reference ideas from different traditions, combining them in ways that feel natural. The blending continues, not forced, but gradual. You think back to the earlier phases of your journey, when identity formed slowly, when systems connected distant places, when belief shaped understanding, when knowledge deepened those connections. Now all of these elements exist together, layered, interwoven. You begin to understand that this complexity is not a weakness. It is a form of strength, a system that can change without losing itself. You walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to fade. The light softens, casting long shadows across the ground. The activity of the day slows but does not stop entirely. There is always some movement, some continuity. You sit and watch as the sky darkens once more, and you begin to see that this phase of the story is not defined by a single empire, a single ruler, or a single moment. It is defined by repetition with variation, by cycles that build on what came before, by change that does not erase but reshapes. The details may shift depending on how they are remembered, how they are recorded, how they are interpreted, but the pattern remains. Endurance through adaptation. As the stars appear above you, you feel that continuity once again, a quiet thread that runs through everything, holding it together, even as the surface continues to change. The pattern of continuity carries you forward, but now the pace begins to change again. You move into a period where the sense of layered identity starts to gather into something more defined, more deliberate. The shifts are not only cultural or intellectual anymore, they begin to take on a clearer political shape. You walk into a city where the atmosphere feels focused, almost purposeful in a new way. The streets are active, but there is a stronger sense of decision behind that activity. Messages move with intention. Decisions seem to carry more weight. Something is consolidating. You begin to hear a name repeated more often, Safavid. At first, it appears within conversations quietly and as part of a movement that is growing, drawing people together through shared belief and leadership. But as you continue, the presence becomes clearer, more structured, more visible. You pass through a gathering where individuals speak with conviction, their tone steady, their focus clear. They are not only discussing governance or trade, they are speaking about identity, about belief, about what defines this land. This is where a new phase begins to take form, one that draws together political authority and religious identity in a more direct way than before. You walk through the city and notice how symbols have become more prominent. They appear in public spaces and gatherings in the way people express themselves. These are not random. They carry meaning, signaling belonging to a shared understanding. This creates cohesion, but it also creates distinction. If you pause and look closely, you can see how this moment shapes boundaries differently than earlier periods. Instead of relying primarily on geography or administration identity, becomes a defining factor, a way of organizing the world. You move into a place of worship where the atmosphere feels both familiar and transformed. Rituals continue, but their expression carries a new emphasis. The space feels unified, directed toward a shared interpretation that is more clearly defined than before. This is where the shift becomes unmistakable. A widely accepted understanding tells us that the Safavid dynasty established a unified Persian state in the early 16th century and made Twelvershiism the official religion, shaping the identity of the region in lasting ways. But standing here within the experience itself, it feels less like a single decision and more like a process that gathers strength over time. Belief, identity, and power aligning more closely. You notice how this affects daily life. Conversations reflect shared references, shared ideas, shared ways of understanding the world. There's a sense of belonging that feels stronger, more clearly defined. People know where they stand. At the same time, there is a quieter layer beneath this clarity. Not everyone experiences this shift in the same way. In some places, the transition feels natural, an extension of what has been forming. In others, it requires adjustment and negotiation time. The accounts that remain offer different impressions depending on where they originate and what they focus on. Some emphasize unity, others hint at complexity beneath that unity. You walk through a marketplace where trade continues, but the interactions feel slightly different. There is a shared framework guiding exchange, shaped not only by economics but by identity. It influences how people relate to one another, how trust is built, how agreements are understood. You begin to see how this phase brings a new kind of strength, a stronger sense of collective identity, a clearer definition of what the system represents, but also a new kind of challenge, maintaining that definition, ensuring that it remains coherent across different regions and communities. You pass a group engaged in discussion, their tone thoughtful. They speak about belief, about authority, about how the two intersect. Their conversation reflects both confidence and awareness. Confidence in what has been established. Awareness of what must be maintained. You think back to earlier moments when tolerance allowed diversity to exist within a broader structure, when flexibility created resilience, when adaptation shaped endurance. Now the system moves toward definition, toward clarity, toward a more unified identity. This does not erase the past, it builds upon it, but it changes the balance. You walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to soften. The light fades, casting a warm glow across the structures. The symbols you have been noticing remain visible even in the dimming light. They carry meaning into the night. You sit and watch as the world quiets once more, and you begin to understand that this phase of the journey is not only about survival or adaptation. It is about definition, about shaping identity in a way that can hold across time. The details may vary depending on how they are remembered, how they are interpreted, how they are experienced. But the shift is clear, a new form of unity, one that will influence everything that follows. As the stars appear above you, you feel that continuity once again, now shaped more clearly than before, still evolving, still enduring. The clarity you have been sensing begins to deepen. You move through spaces where identity feels more firmly held, not only in symbols or rituals, but in the quiet confidence of everyday interactions. People no longer seem to be adjusting to change. They are living within something that feels established, something that defines how they see themselves and the world around them. And yet, even within that certainty, there are layers. You walk into a gathering where belief is not only practiced but discussed. The tone is thoughtful, measured, reflective. These are not casual exchanges. They carry meaning that reaches beyond the moment. You begin to notice how faith now shapes more than personal life. It shapes structure. Authority is understood through it. Decisions are guided by it. You listen as individuals speak about leadership in terms that blend governance with spiritual responsibility. It is not simply about managing people or resources. It is about maintaining a sense of order that feels both visible and unseen. This creates a powerful connection, but also a delicate balance. If you stay with this moment a little longer, you begin to sense that this alignment between belief and authority brings both strength and tension. It strengthens unity, but it also requires consistency. Differences become more noticeable, not because they did not exist before, but because the framework around them has become more defined. You walk through a neighborhood where daily life continues in familiar ways. Families prepare meals, children move through their routines. Conversations flow in the same steady rhythm you've seen throughout your journey. The continuity remains, but the meaning behind it feels more structured. There is a shared understanding that guides behavior, that shapes expectations, that connects individuals to something larger than themselves. This creates cohesion, a sense of belonging that extends beyond local identity. You pass a place of learning where teachings are shared with care. The atmosphere is calm but focused. The words spoken carry weight not only because of what they say, but because of what they represent. They define how people understand their place within society, within belief, within the world itself. What you are seeing may only be part of it. There are quieter layers beneath this surface where interpretation varies, where individuals engage with these ideas in their own ways. Not every experience is identical. Not every understanding is the same. But the overall structure holds. You begin to see how this phase creates a stronger sense of unity than before, not only through system or networks, but through shared meaning. You walk through a market where interactions feel guided by this shared framework. Trust is shaped not only by familiarity, but by common understanding. Agreements are made with an awareness that extends beyond simple exchange. This influences how people relate to one another, how they cooperate, how they resolve differences. At the same time, there is more happening here than first appears. You notice a quiet conversation between two individuals whose perspectives do not fully align. Their discussion is careful, respectful, but there is a difference in interpretation beneath their words. It is subtle, but present. The framework allows for unity, but it does not eliminate variation. You continue walking and reach a point where the city opens into a wider view. From here, you can see how the structures, the beliefs, the daily life all connect into a larger pattern. It feels stable, defined, but also complex. You think back to earlier moments when tolerance allowed many identities to exist side by side, when flexibility created resilience, when adaptation shaped survival. Now the system moves toward coherence, toward a shared definition. This creates strength, but it also requires careful balance. The picture begins to shift when you consider how this structure must be maintained across different regions, different unities, different perspectives. It's not automatic. It requires attention. You walk toward a quieter area as the day begins to soften. The light fades gently, casting long shadows across the ground. The sounds of the city slow but do not disappear entirely. There is always movement, always continuity. You sit and reflect on what you have seen, and you begin to understand that this phase of the journey is about more than identity. It is about alignment, bringing together belief structure and daily life into a single, coherent system, one that can endure, but only if it remains balanced. As the sky darkens and the stars return, you feel that familiar sense of calm, and beneath it the awareness that endurance is not only about strength, it is about maintaining harmony within complexity. The sense of unity you have been moving through does not exist in isolation. As you continue forward, you begin to feel another presence, distant at first, then gradually more noticeable. It does not move through the land in the same way as the systems you have observed. It approaches from the outside, watching, measuring, waiting. You walk into a port city where the air carries a different energy. Ships rest along the shoreline, their shapes unfamiliar compared to those you have seen before. The people here move with a certain awareness, as if they are standing at the edge of something that is not yet fully understood. This is where the outside world begins to look more closely. You hear conversations about distant empires, about lands beyond the horizon that are not part of the familiar patterns of this region. The names are new, their meaning still forming in the minds of those who speak them. At first, these connections feel distant, trade observation curiosity. But if you remain here a little longer, you begin to notice how these interactions deepen. Goods arrive that were not seen before. Ideas follow them, methods, tools, ways of thinking. The exchange grows, and with it a new kind of influence. You walk along the edge of the harbour and watch as goods are unloaded carefully. The process is organised, but the items themselves carry something different. They reflect systems that developed elsewhere, shaped by the conditions you have not yet experienced. This creates both opportunity and uncertainty. You begin to understand that interaction with distant powers introduces a new layer of complexity. Not only internal balance, but external pressure. Some traces point one way, suggesting that these early encounters were largely economic, focused on exchange and mutual benefit. Others hint at something deeper, a gradual shift in influence that would extend beyond trade into politics and control. The full picture does not settle easily. You move through the city and notice how local leaders respond. Their approach is measured. They observe, adapt, incorporate what seems useful. At the same time, there is caution, a recognition that not everything should be absorbed without consideration. This creates a careful balance, engagement without surrender. You pass a gathering where individuals discuss these developments. Their tone is thoughtful, not alarmed, but attentive. They consider how these new connections might affect their systems, their identity, their autonomy. The questions are not simple. They do not have immediate answers. You begin to see how this moment represents a shift in perspective. Earlier, the focus was on internal development, on building and maintaining systems within the land. Now attention extends outward, toward other powers, toward other ways of organizing the world. You walk through a marketplace where goods from distant regions are displayed alongside familiar items. The contrast is visible but not overwhelming. People examine these new objects with curiosity, integrating them slowly into their understanding. Change enters gradually, but it does not remain small. There is more happening here than first appears. These interactions begin to shape expectations, to introduce new standards, new comparisons. The way people think about power, about wealth, about structure begins to shift in subtle ways. You notice this in the way conversations unfold. References extend beyond the local, beyond the familiar. The world feels larger being, but also more interconnected. You continue walking and reach a place where officials meet to discuss these developments. Their focus is steady, but there is a sense of complexity in their deliberations. They are not only managing internal systems now, they are responding to external forces, forces that do not operate by the same rules. The picture becomes more layered when you consider how these outside powers view this region. To them, it is not only a place of culture and identity, it is a place of resources, of strategic importance, of potential influence. This difference in perspective creates tension. Even before any direct conflict appears, you walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to soften. The light reflects off the water, creating a calm surface that hides the movement beneath. It feels familiar, a pattern you have seen before. Surface calm, underlying change. You sit and watch as the ships prepare to depart, carrying goods, ideas, and influence back across the water. The movement continues steady and quiet, and you begin to understand that this phase of the journey introduces a new kind of challenge, not one that comes from within the system, but one that interacts with it, shapes it, tests it. As the sky darkens and the city settles into evening, the presence of this new influence remains, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And in that quiet moment, you sense that the balance you have been following is about to become more difficult to maintain. Not because it is weak, but because it is now part of a larger world, one that does not always move at the same pace. The presence of the wider world does not fade once it arrives. It settles into the rhythm of the land, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a weight that is harder to ignore. You continue walking, and the places you enter now carry a different kind of tension. Not immediate, not explosive, but steady and persistent. You move through a city where the streets feel familiar, yet the atmosphere has changed. The patterns of life continue, but they are shaped by new pressures, new expectations, new comparisons. People are no longer looking only inward. They are aware of what lies beyond. You hear conversations that reflect this shift. There is talk of progress, of change, of the need to adjust to a world that is moving differently than before. The tone is not unified. Some voices carry confidence, others carry hesitation. There is no single response. You walk past a building where officials gather their discussions focused on how to navigate these changes. The decisions they consider are no longer only about maintaining internal balance. They involve positioning adaptation and response to forces that operate beyond their control. This creates a new kind of complexity, one that requires not just stability but flexibility in a different direction. You begin to notice how this affects daily life. In the marketplace, goods from distant regions appear more frequently. Their presence is no longer unusual. It is expected. Alongside them come new methods, new tools, new ways of organizing work and exchange. Some are adopted quickly, others are approached with caution. If you remain here a little longer, you begin to see how this creates division in perspective. Some individuals embrace these changes, seeing opportunity, growth, connection. Others hold more closely to established ways, concerned that too much change may disrupt the balance that has been maintained for so long. Both views exist together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. You walk into a space where education is taking place and the content reflects this shift. New ideas are introduced alongside older ones. The discussion moves between tradition and innovation, between continuity and change. There is no clear resolution, only ongoing conversation. The picture becomes more layered when you consider how quickly these changes are occurring. Earlier transformations unfolded slowly, allowing time for adjustment. Now the pace feels faster, more demanding. Adaptation must happen more quickly, and not everyone moves at the same speed. You notice this in a quiet exchange between two individuals. One speaks of the need to modernize to align with new systems that are emerging elsewhere. The other responds with concern, emphasizing the importance of preserving what has been built. Their conversation is calm, but it reflects a deeper question. How much should change, and how much should remain? You continue walking and reach an area where new structures are being built. Their design differs slightly from what you have seen before. Materials, methods, layout, all showing signs of influence from outside. The change is visible, but it does not replace everything. It integrates, at least for now. Some fragments of this period suggest that attempts to modernize brought both progress and strain. Efforts to reform systems, to introduce new approaches, often created tension between different parts of society. The details varied depending on where you look, but the pattern is consistent. Change brings both opportunity and challenge. You walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to soften. The light fades across buildings that now reflect multiple influences, multiple layers of history, multiple directions of change. You sit and watch as people move through their routines, some adapting quickly, some moving more slowly, all part of the same system. You begin to understand that this phase of the journey is not only about external influence, it is about internal response. How a system adjusts when faced with new conditions, how it balances what it has been with what it might become. You think back to earlier moments when survival required adaptation, when identity formed through shared experience, when systems expanded, when belief shaped understanding, when knowledge deepened those connections. Now the challenge is different, not building from within, but responding to what comes from outside. As the sky darkens and the city settles into evening, the tension remains. Not overwhelming, but present. And within that tension, you sense the beginning of something that will reshape everything once again. Not immediately, but inevitably. A shift that still beyond adjustment into transformation. The shift you sense does not remain subtle. It begins to move more quickly, pressing into daily life in ways that are harder to overlook. You continue walking, and the cities you enter now feel caught between two rhythms, one steady and familiar, the other faster, more urgent, less predictable. You feel it in the way people speak, in the way decisions are made, in the way time itself seems to move. You walk into a wide boulevard where new structures rise beside older ones. Their lines are sharper, their materials different, their presence more deliberate. They reflect a vision of change that is no longer gradual. It is intentional. You notice how movement through the city has increased. Vehicles pass where once there were only animals or foot traffic. Communication travels more quickly. Information spreads faster than before. This changes how people experience the world. Distance feels smaller. Time feels compressed. You pass a group gathered around a source of information, listening, closely reacting in real time. News that once would have taken days or weeks to arrive now reaches them almost instantly. This creates a different kind of awareness, one that does not allow for slow adjustment. Everything happens closer together. You begin to sense how this affects the balance you have been following. The system which once adapted gradually is now being asked to adjust more rapidly than ever before. Some accept this pace, others struggle with it. You walk through a neighborhood where older traditions remain visible. The routines continue, the patterns familiar. But even here, the influence of change is present. It appears in small details, in the way people interact, in the tools they use, in the expectations they hold. Nothing remains untouched. Even if the changes are not always obvious, you encounter a conversation that reflects this tension clearly. One voice speaks of progress, of the need to move forward to align with the modern world. Another responds with a concern questioning what might be lost in the process. Neither perspective is dismissed, but neither fully resolves the tension. This moment carries a weight that feels different from earlier phases. The changes are not only structural, they are personal. They affect how individuals see themselves, their identity, their place within the system. You walk into a space where authority is expressed more directly than before. The presence of leadership is visible, its direction clear. Decisions are implemented with speed, with a sense of urgency that reflects the pace of the time. This creates momentum, but also pressure. If you stay with this moment a little longer, you begin to see how the gap between different parts of society becomes more noticeable. Some move easily within this new rhythm. Others feel disconnected from it, uncertain how to adjust. The difference is not always visible at first, but it grows over time. You pass through a marketplace where traditional goods sit beside new products. The contrast is striking, but not yet fully settled. People move between them, choosing, adapting, deciding what fits into their lives. This is where change becomes real, not in policy or structure, but in daily choices. The fragments that remain from this period suggest a rapid transformation, one that reshaped the country's political, economic, and social systems within a relatively short span of time. But the experience of that transformation was not the same for everyone. Some saw opportunity, others felt disruption. Many experience both at once. You walk toward the edge of the city as the day begins to soften. The light reflects off both old and new structures, blending them into a single landscape that carries the marks of both past and present. You sit and watch as the city continues to move even as evening approaches. The pace does not fully slow. It adjusts, but it does not return to what it was before. You think back to earlier moments when change unfolded slowly, when systems had time to adapt, when continuity felt steady and predictable. Now everything feels closer, faster, more intense, and within that intensity the balance becomes harder to maintain. You begin to understand that this phase of the journey is not only about transformation, it is about acceleration, a shift in how change itself happens. As the sky darkens and the lights of the city begin to appear, you feel that contrast more clearly than ever, the calm of night and the movement that continues beneath it, and you sense that something is building, not quietly, but steadily, toward a moment that will redefine everything once again. The tension you have been sensing finally begins to gather into something unmistakable. Not sudden, not chaotic at first, but focused. You walk through the city and the pace feels different again. Not just fast, but compressed, as if many years of pressure are now converging into a single direction. Conversations are sharper. Movements are more purposeful. The air itself seems to carry a kind of anticipation. People are no longer only discussing change. They are responding to it. You pass a group gathered closely together, their voices low but intense. They speak of leadership, of direction, of dissatisfaction that has been building over time. It is not new. It has been present beneath earlier moments, beneath the adjustments and adaptations you have been following. Now it begins to surface. You continue walking and notice how this feeling spreads across different parts of the city. It does not look the same everywhere. In some places it appears as quiet conversation, in others as visible gathering. But the underlying current is shared. Something is shifting. You move into a wide open space where more people have gathered. Their presence is calm but unified. They stand together not in disorder but with a sense of collective purpose that feels different from anything you have seen before. This is not a routine. It is a moment. You begin to understand that the system which has adapted and endured through so many phases is now facing a different kind of challenge. Not from outside, but from within. You listen as voices rise not in anger, but in clarity. They speak about identity, about direction, about the gap between what has been built and what is now being experienced. There is conviction in their words, a sense that something must change. If you follow this moment closely, you can see how many layers of the past are present within it. The long history of adaptation, the balance between tradition and change, the influence of outside forces, the pace of modernization. All of it converges here. You walk through the crowd and notice how varied it is. Different ages, different backgrounds, different perspectives, and yet they share a common focus. This creates a powerful alignment, one that is not imposed from above, but formed from within. The events that unfold during this period would come to be known as the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a turning point that reshaped the country's political structure and redefined its direction. But standing here within the moment itself, it does not feel like a single event. It feels like the release of accumulated pressure, a response to everything that has been building over time. You continue moving and see how the structures of authority respond. There is movement, adjustment, attempts to regain control to redirect the situation, but the dynamic has changed. The center is no longer the only source of direction. The movement now has its own momentum. You notice how communication plays a role here just as it did in earlier phases. Messages spread quickly, carried not only through formal systems, but through people, through gatherings, through shared understanding. The speed is striking, faster than earlier transformations, more immediate. You walk into a quieter street and see individuals reflecting on what is happening. Their expressions are thoughtful, not only reactive. They are considering what comes next, what this moment means, how it will shape the future. The situation becomes more complicated when you notice that not all perspectives are the same. Even within this shared movement, there are differences, different hopes, different expectations, different visions of what change should look like. These differences do not stop the movement, but they exist within it. You return to the larger space as the day begins to soften. The light fades across the gathered crowd, casting long shadows that stretch across the ground. The atmosphere remains focused, but it also carries a sense of transition. Something is ending, something else is beginning. You think back to everything you have seen, the early settlements, the rise of empires, the systems of connection, the cycles of adaptation, each phase built upon the last, and now all of it leads to this, a moment where direction is redefined, not quietly, but decisively. As evening approaches, the energy shifts slightly. The intensity softens, but the purpose remains. People begin to move, to disperse, to carry what has happened into the next stage. Because this moment does not stand alone, it continues into what follows. You sit for a moment watching the last light fade, and you begin to understand that endurance is not only about surviving change, it is about reaching moments where change becomes unavoidable and moving through them. Even when the outcome is not yet clear, the movement does not end with the moment. It settles, it reshapes, it continues. You walk through the same streets, but everything feels quieter now. Not because activity has stopped, but because something has shifted beneath it. The urgency that filled the air softened into a different kind of presence, one that feels established, defined. You pass by buildings where decisions are now made within a new framework. The structure of authority has changed, but the need for structure itself has not. People move through these spaces with purpose, adjusting to the patterns that are forming. There is familiarity within the change. You begin to notice how quickly new systems begin to feel normal. What once felt uncertain becomes routine. Conversations that once carried tension now carry clarity, even if not everyone experiences that clarity in the same way. The transition becomes part of daily life. You walk into a marketplace where activity continues as it always has. Goods are exchanged, voices rise and fall, people move through their routines. The surface remains steady even as the deeper structure has shifted. This is something you have seen before. Change layered over continuity. If you stay with this moment a little longer, you begin to see how the past still moves within the present. The patterns formed long ago, the habits of adaptation, the ability to absorb and reshape all of it continues to guide what happens now. Nothing truly disappears, it transforms. You pass a group engaged in quiet discussion reflecting on recent events. Their tone is calm but thoughtful. They speak not only about what has happened, but about what it means, how it fits into the larger story. This awareness feels important, a recognition that the present is part of something much longer. You walk toward a quieter area and sit looking out across the land as the day begins to fade. The same landscape stretches before you unchanged in its form, but shaped by everything that has taken place upon it. Mountains, deserts, cities, all carrying layers of time. You think back to the very beginning, to the early settlements that learned to survive in a difficult land, to the first moments of connection, to the rise of empires that stretched across continents, to the systems that allowed difference to exist within unity, to the cycles of change that reshaped everything again and again, and now to this moment, where the story continues. The picture never resolves into a single simple explanation. There are too many layers, too many perspectives, too many paths that intersect and diverge. But if you look at the whole journey, something becomes clear. Endurance does not come from remaining unchanged. It comes from the ability to adapt without losing identity, to absorb influence without disappearing, to redefine structure while carrying forward what matters. This is the thread that runs through everything you have seen. You sit quietly as the light fades further, the sky shifting into deeper tones. The sounds of the day soften, blending into a calm that feels familiar, almost timeless. The movement slows, the story settles, and you begin to feel that sense of continuity once more, not as something distant, but as something present, something ongoing. The land remains, the people continue, the patterns evolve, and the story moves forward not as a series of endings, but as a continuous unfolding. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the images drift. The early fires, the long roads, the quiet conversations, the shifting cities, all of it blending into a single steady rhythm. And as the night deepens, that rhythm becomes softer, slower, more distant, like a memory settling into rest. You feel the calm return not as an absence of thought, but as a gentle presence that carries everything you have seen into stillness. The journey does not disappear. It simply becomes quiet. And in that quiet you find the final understanding that Persia did not last so long because it resisted change. It lasted because it moved with it, again and again, until change itself became a part of its identity. The night holds that thought gently, without urgency, without demand, just a quiet awareness. As the stars remained above, steady and distant, you feel the story fade into the background, not ending but resting. And as you drift deeper into that calm, the world you have walked through becomes softer, quieter, carried into stillness. End of script, sweet dreams.